Hello and welcome to this third episode of the Arcane Magic Guide that I'm doing for Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition. This episode will be about level 3 spells, and I'm excited. There's some great spells in level 3. It's a stacked spell level, a really strong spell level, the strongest one that we're going to have done yet, and a nice change of pace after level 2, which had a bunch of garbage and a couple decent spells, but nothing that really unlocked the full potential of the Mage. In spell level 3, there are some awesome spells that are good when you get them and that get even better through late game and become part of the level 31 or late TOB Mage's arsenal. Some of the spells that make mages the most powerful characters in the game by the end of the game. So I'm excited. Just to recap the perspective that we're going to look at these spells through, I'm talking about Baldur's Gate Enhanced Edition here, and I'm operating off of the latest version of Baldur's Gate 2 Enhanced Edition, which I just downloaded from Steam about a week ago. It being September 2022 right now. So whatever that patch is, I'm going to focus on playing under one of the harder settings, but still not SCS and unmodded. So the conversation here is going to focus on power gaming on a die as few times as possible or no reload basis on some of the harder difficulty settings, but I'm not going to focus on SCS. I may touch on Sword Coast stratagems here and there, talking about these spells, but I'm really focusing on the out-of-the-box unmodded game that anybody can download and play. Also, I typically do play solo without a party, but I will talk about these spells and rate them on a party basis, as well as discussing them solo. That just may bias me. And the approach I'm going to take is I'm going to go, just like with level 1 and level 2, I'm going to go through each of the spells in level 3 in alphabetical order. And I'm going to take an analytical rule set first, numbers first approach. Talk a lot about probabilities and statistics and really getting deep into the game's rich rule set. And I'm going to rank each spell on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being the absolute best rating reserved for game-changing or game-breaking spells that represent a huge power spike when obtained, and level 1 being joke spells that are the absolute worst spells in the game. I think the way the rating system has played out so far, we haven't had any level 10 spells yet, rank 10 spells yet, which is correct. I think there's only a few of those in the entire game. I want to highlight those when we get to them. Will we have one in this level? TBD. But I think the way it's played out, level 8 is an excellent spell. Level 9 is really a standout spell. Some spell levels don't even have one at level 9. Level 2, or at rank 9, I didn't give any ratings of 9 to any level 2 spells. And then rank 2 and 3 ends up being where a lot of spells end up, because in this game there are sort of maybe 5 to 7 spells per spell level that are really good from a power gaming perspective and really strong, and the rest of them are sort of for fun or decidedly less strong. So let's see how level 3 turns out and get right into the spells. First spell in level 3, again going by alphabetical order. First spell is Clairvoyance. Clairvoyance is a divination spell. It has a cast time of 3. And the Clairvoyance spell, I'll read the description. The Clairvoyance spell empowers the wizard to see in her mind the geographical features and buildings of the region she is currently exploring. It extends to a great range, but cannot reveal creatures or their movements. This spell does not function indoors or underground. So what does this spell do? If you cast this spell when you're in a quote outdoors area, then this spell will reveal the entire map, not give you actual vision of it, but will make the entire map as though it's already been explored, so that if you go to your map screen after casting the spell, you'll see the entire area. So this is really an ease of use spell. This spell doesn't make your party or your mage more powerful in any way, especially if you've already played the game and you know what the map layouts look like. The spell just saves you some time exploring an area by moving all over it by foot. So I put it in that category of ease of use spells, most akin to things like Friends and Knock, although with this one, there's not really any argument that it's gonna make your party stronger in game. It's not like it saves you money. It's not strategically important. It doesn't open chests for you. This is just pure ease of use. So before we go further and rate this spell, let's talk a little bit in more detail about how it works. And there's really only one thing to talk about, which is the one limitation on this spell, which is that it doesn't work indoors. So the spell description says it doesn't work indoors or underground. Each map in Baldur's Gate has a variable that tells the game whether the map is considered to be indoors or outdoors. And it's not always intuitive. It's usually pretty intuitive, not 100%. So I'll give some examples of maps that you might want to use this on, and whether the game considers them to be indoors or outdoors. The Firewine Dungeon is indoors, pretty obvious. The Underdark, I think that's a little ambiguous. I guess it is underground, but it's a large area that's not formed of, I guess, man or creature-made structures. But in any event, the Underdark is indoors, so you cannot use this in the Underdark. The Undercity, underneath Baldur's Gate, where you fight Saravak, is considered to be indoors as well. I guess it's consistent with the spell description that says it doesn't work underground. Solden Cellar is considered to be outdoors. The Tree of Life is considered to be outdoors. By the way, using this spell in the Tree of Life is quite helpful because the map will then show to you the areas that will expand if you use one of those tree nuts on them, because those areas will be walkable even if the tree has yet to expand to those areas. And this, I guess this is the only one that doesn't make total sense. Hell, when you go down to it at the end of Baldur's Gate 2, is considered to be outdoors. So you can use this in Hell, which I thought Hell was underground. I guess the game is getting into the theological here and telling us that Hell is not actually in the center of the earth. It's somewhere else that's considered to be outdoors. So go figure. All right, let's talk about quality of this spell for a second. There's no combat advantage. Already said that. But nonetheless, I do find this spell pretty useful. And I do find myself taking it and using it occasionally. It helps with getting around some massive outdoor areas that it's easy to get lost in, such as the Umar Hills, the Druid Grove. For some reason, the pathing in the Druid Grove always drives me insane, so I like using this spell. The Tree of Life is another big one. That's a maze, and if you cast this, it's much easier to figure out where to go. And if you're playing the trilogy, then it is quite nice to return to some of the wide open outdoor areas in BG1 later on and cast this spell to know exactly where to go to find different encounters. If you're a new player and you've never played the game before, I think the utility goes up even further because you can usually tell areas of interest just from the map without having visited them. For example, you can identify a cave opening, you can identify the Stonehenge-like structure where a basilisk is standing if you just cast this spell. So if you enter an area in BG1 and you immediately cast this, you're going to reveal the entire map and probably be able to tell where the 3 or 4 points of interest in one of those wilderness maps are. Other note I have here is that if you're playing with summons and Farsight, so you're using Farsight to see different areas of the map, then Clairvoyance is helpful to know where to target the Farsight to be able to see that area, see the right area, and send your summons there. So I do find myself using this spell, but it's sort of a dead slot in a really strong spell level. The spell is not going to help you clear a dungeon or help your party in any way, as said. It is true ease of use. I think if this was available at level 2, it would be a significantly higher rating, like a 4 or a 5, because it does have utility, and that's a weaker spell level. But level 3 is just a stronger level, so I'll give this a 3 out of 10 rating. And before I come off this, I just want to make the point that, yes, this is an ease of use spell, but if you really think about it, there's a lot of spells that are considered conventionally strong in this game that just because they have some combat type ability or defense type ability are considered to be good, even though they're truly ease of use. And a classic example is Invisibility 10-foot radius, because Invisibility lasts 24 hours, so you could always cast Invisibility individually on your entire party and then rest and restart and never have a use for Invisibility 10-foot radius ever. Yet people consider Invisibility 10-foot radius to be a good spell. In reality, it's just an ease of use spell if you think about the fact that it just stops you from having to click 5 times. And that's the main function of it, to stop you having to click Invisibility 5 or 6 times. So before we all crap on ease of use spells like Clairvoyance, I think you got to think a little bit more critically about how many different spells fall into that category. And at the end of the day, Spellbook is about feeling powerful, feeling like you cut through the game easily, and Clairvoyance does help with that. 3 out of 10 rating. Next spell, Detect Illusion. This is another divination spell. Cast time of 3, and I'll read the description. When cast at a point designated by the wizard, this spell will cancel all illusion phantasm spells of 3rd level and lower in the area. Spells that are affected by this are Reflected Image, Invisibility, Mirror Image, and Non-Detection. It is important to note that the caster can control just who this spell affects. Therefore, it will affect only enemies of the caster. The area of effect is roughly a 15-foot radius around the target. The target's magic resistance, if any, does not affect this spell. So this is another illusion / invisibility dispelling spell, like Detect Invisibility, the level 2 spell. And to understand it, got to focus on the spells that it dispels given in the description, which is only 3rd level or lower illusion spells. So Reflected Image, Invisibility, Mirror Image, and Non-Detection. That's a very limited list. Very limited. Breaking it down further, there are really 2 purposes to this spell. One of them would be to bring enemies out of invisibility, and the other one would be to take down these buffs, Reflected Image and Mirror Image. In reality, nobody ever casts Reflected Image, and it's extremely weak. It only gives 1 mirror, so the only buff of note that you would even consider taking down is Mirror Image. So 2 functions: bring enemies out of invisibility and debuff Mirror Image. Thinking about each of those functions, for purpose 1, bringing enemies out of invis, it's basically impossible to justify ever taking this spell, Detect Illusion, over taking the level 2 spell, Detect Invisibility. Detect Invisibility has a much wider radius, basically dispelling invisibility in the entire line of sight of the caster, whereas this is a 15-foot radius. This is a longer cast time. Detect Illusion takes up a valuable level 3 spell slot versus Detect Invisibility at level 2, the weakest arcane spell level. And critically, Detect Invisibility will also dispel Improved Invisibility and Shadow Door, whereas Detect Illusion will only dispel regular way invisibility. So clearly, Detect Invisibility, the level 2 spell, is just better than Detect Illusion for purposes of getting rid of invisibility. The only way that, or the only argument that Detect Illusion is superior is that Detect Illusion will dispel and work through non-detection, whereas non-detection will block all of the level 2 divination spells, Detect Invisibility, Invisibility Purge, and Glitter Dust. By the way, we'll get to non-detection. That's a separate level 3 spell, but that's basically the only function of non-detection, is to block level 2 divination spells. So Detect Illusion does get rid of non-detection. Theoretically, if you're facing a non-detected opponent, this is the spell you would use that's of equal or lower level to dispel that effect, that non-detection effect. But in reality, very, very few enemies in this game are non-detected. Hardly any at all. I can't, aside from the enemies that have the cloak, which Detect Illusion doesn't dispel the non-detection bestowed by the cloak. It can dispel the invisibility that the cloaked enemy has on, but it doesn't dispel the non-detection. There's just no enemies essentially that use non-detection. So that just means that Detect Illusion is left here as sort of a relic. It's a counter to a spell, non-detection, which is hardly ever used. Returning to the two purposes. So purpose 1, bringing enemies out of invisibility. Level 2 spell Detect Invis, or the higher level spells Oracle, True Sight, etc., which also go through non-detection, are going to be much better at that function. Purpose 2, bringing down somebody's mirror image. Do you really need to stock a level 3 spell to take out an enemy's level 2 spell? No. You're going to use some other means of getting rid of an enemy's mirror image. You're just going to whack the mage till it goes away, or at higher levels, you're going to be using True Sight to eliminate mirror images. So rewinding these two functions, this spell does neither of them particularly well. It's just not worth a level 3 spell slot. If lots of enemies at low to mid levels, before you get True Sight, used non-detection, then theoretically this spell would be the answer to that, but that's just not the reality of Baldur's Gate. So this all in all is probably the worst anti-illusion spell in the game, and it's not a good spell in otherwise a strong level. You're never going to want to take this, and I'll rate it 2 out of 10. Next spell, Dire Charm. Here we go again with the charm spells. I'm not going to spend time reading the full description of this. I think the summary is that whereas the level 1 spell gave enemies a +3 bonus to save versus it, this spell does not have a bonus to save. It's just a straight saving throw versus spell to resist Dire Charm. All the same weaknesses of level 1 charm are present here. Many enemies are immune to charm. The duration is very short, 5 rounds, and does not scale. And there's a save versus this, so a lot of the time when this is cast, you're gonna simply have wasted a round and accomplished nothing. And versus so I guess the question really in rating this spell is how bad is it? It's a bad spell. It's clear that it's a bad spell. How bad is it? The only difference versus the level 1 spell is the difference of the level 1 spell has a +3 bonus to enemy saves, and this one has none. That on a d20 works out to a 15% difference in the likelihood that this spell is going to hit versus the level 1 spell. Is that really worth giving up a level 3 spell slot for a 15% extra chance of charming somebody? You're going to give up a skull trap instead of a mirror image? I don't think so. In situations where you do want charm, I think you're just better off stocking level 1 charm and taking a couple shots to get it to connect. Hell, even giving up 3 level 1 spell slots to cast regular way Charm Person 3 times is better than giving up 1 super valuable level 3 slot to take this spell. So I guess Charm is important to D&D rules or lore or whatever. That's why we keep getting these horrible Charm spells. Here's another one, and I think this one is actually the worst of the Charm spells. So I'm going to give this a 1 out of 10. Can't see ever taking this. If you really want Charm, either take Domination, that's going to have a penalty to enemy saves, or take level 1 and just take a couple instances of it. Don't use up a valuable level 3 spell slot for this garbage spell. 1 out of 10. Next up, we have Dispel Magic. Dispel Magic is an abjuration spell. It has a cast time of 5, operates over a 15-foot area of effect radius, and there's no saving throw versus Dispel Magic. Instead, Dispel Magic and Remove Magic, which we'll get to later, operate on this unique, very unique to these 2 spells mechanic that essentially makes it more likely that the spell will dispel if the target spells being dispelled are cast by a caster of lower level, and less likely if those spells are cast by a caster of higher level. It's sort of like a dueling caster concept where the higher level caster will have a higher chance to dispel the lower level caster's protections or other spells. I am going to get into detail on that mechanic, the odds, and all of the numbers that are given in the description here when I get to Remove Magic later on in discussing level 3. But for present purposes, I think the easiest way to analyze Dispel Magic is, because it is so similar to Remove Magic, is to just talk for a second about which appears at the same level, is to just talk for a second about which of these 2 spells is better. Because given that they do very similar things, if one of Remove Magic or Dispel Magic is clearly superior, then immediately the other spell at the same level is going to become a bad spell that you would never take. Instead, you would take the other one. So what is the difference between Dispel Magic and Remove Magic? The only difference between these 2 spells is that Remove Magic is party friendly and will only attempt to dispel effects on non-party characters inside the area of effect. So you can freely cast Remove Magic onto an area including yourself or including multiple members of your party plus some enemies, and Remove Magic will solely work against the enemies. Dispel Magic, on the other hand, is not party friendly. It'll target anybody in the area of effect, including party members. So, let's just stop right there. That's a critical difference. Getting dispelled is completely devastating in this game. It'll immediately remove all combat protections. Essentially all buffs except for spell protections will go away. Resistance spells will go away. Stone Skin will go away. I'll get into more detail on exactly which, but the point is that getting dispelled in combat is devastating and will probably lead to death or having to run away immediately. So the answer to whether Dispel Magic or Remove Magic is better, the first point that's important is that you would never cast this Dispel Magic, you would never cast this spell in combat. You just would never do it. It's going to lead to one or more of your party members becoming dispelled and getting slaughtered. The one situation in which you would need to target your own party members or yourself is when you're out of combat and you need to remove a negative effect. Like being diseased or having an ability score reduced, one of those effects. And if you're in that situation,
there's multiple different options to get the outcome that you want. You can have a cleric in your party, and the cleric gets Dispel Magic as a level 3 spell, and is probably going to be higher level than your mage, because clerics level faster than arcane casters. So you could use the cleric version. Or you could cast a spell off the scroll, or you could visit any temple and just buy Dispel Magic. So in summary, the one use case that you would want this spell for, where you need to target your own party members, you have multiple different options that don't involve ever memorizing this spell, that some of which are superior. Cleric Dispel Magic is always going to be stronger because clerics level faster. So I think, just without getting into the detailed mechanics of this spell, which are very important, we'll get into them when we talk about Remove Magic. I think the bottom line is, Dispel Magic, there's really never a reason to take it over Remove Magic. Dispel Magic is something that, if you need to cast it on one of your own party members, you could do it through a cleric, scroll, etc., temple, and it doesn't have the in-combat use cases that Remove Magic does. So I struggle between a 2 or a 3 because the effect on enemies is quite powerful, but I think the presence of a superior alternative in the cleric book that does the exact same thing leads me to say that this is a 2 out of 10 spell for Dispel Magic. The effect is quite powerful, but there's just no reason to take this ever over Remove Magic, I think. So 2 out of 10. Next spell, Fireball. Fireball is an evocation spell with a cast time of 3. It operates over a 15-foot radius circular area of effect. Saving throw causes half damage. A fireball is an explosive burst of flame which detonates with a low roar and delivers damage proportional to the level of the wizard who cast it. 1d6 points of damage for each level experience of the caster, up to a maximum of 10d6 damage. I'll stop there because the rest of this description really just adds some color around what it looks like to cast a fireball. Aside from noting again that there is a saving throw available to enemies that are in the area of effect, they can save for half damage. So a fireball spell. This is sort of the classic mage spell. At least that's what I thought growing up playing Baldur's Gate 1. This is the spell that we all wanted access to as soon as somebody used it against us in BG1, because we saw, area of effect damage, this awesome fire graphic, and the ability to one-shot kill groups of low-level enemies. Pretty awesome, right? And in fact, this is a really powerful spell in BG1. Without talking about relative value at all for a second, this is a powerful spell when you get access to it in BG1. We were right. Our instincts were right playing this game through early levels. Yes, this is a strong spell. It's on a standalone basis. Thinking more analytically about this, though, and thinking about the relative strength of this spell and also how it holds up through SOA and TOB, Baldur's Gate 2 and TOB completely changed the game with the introduction of many fire-resistant enemies. I think fire resistance is one of the most common resistances, either high fire resistance or immunity to fire damage, that you'll see in BG2 and Throne of Ball. It's almost as though the game creators realized that Fireball was super busted in Baldur's Gate 1 and decided to overcorrect by creating so many fire immune enemies as you get into mid SOA to the end of the saga. And it feels like by the time Throne of Ball is reached, almost every enemy, it feels like, is 100% fire immune. There are exceptions, like some of the humanoid enemies or undead enemies that you'll face in Throne of Ball are not fire immune, but so many are completely immune to fire. Balthazar, fire giants, Yagashura, obviously, all the demons are completely immune to fire. The list goes on and on. Many enemies that you wouldn't think should be immune to fire are, just because they're high level enemies, and that's what this game does with high level enemies. It makes them immune to fire. So that fact just greatly weakens the spell, obviously, when you get to higher levels. Plus, there's some other mechanics that make the spell disfavored at higher levels. Most importantly, the cap of 10d6 on damage. I think to really assess how good this spell is and whether you should be taking it, what we need to do, aside from noting how it doesn't have much scalability because of resistances, is compare it to the other Big Daddy area of effect damage spell that's available on level 3, and that's Skull Trap, which we'll get to Skull Trap later, but let's just compare Fireball to Skull Trap for a second, because they both do very similar things, and if one's clearly better, that means we're going to take it most of the time, or all the time. So let's talk about these two spells. The cast time is the same, cast time of 3 for both Fireball and Skull Trap. That means you can insta-cast them with Vecna easily inside an improved Alacrity. The cast distance is the same, 40 feet. The damage amount is the same up until level 10, just the base damage, which is 1d6 per level, but then with save versus spell for half. But then after that, as soon as you get to level 11, Skull Trap becomes more powerful, just looking at the damage rolls, because Skull Trap scales to level 20. So Skull Trap is just way superior to Fireball in terms of the amount of damage that you get. The area of effect, the spell descriptions say that they're the same 15-foot radius, but Fireball just does explode over a larger radius. That's demonstrable if you test in game. Skull Trap is still a nice radius, but narrower. This radius difference is in fact the only way that Fireball is better than Skull Trap. That small radius difference. Next difference is the I call it the spell deployment type, but just the style of the spell. Fireball always insta procs. So if you cast Fireball, the Fireball is going to explode as soon as the Fireball projectile that emanates from the Mage hits the spot where you clicked the magic, click the cast command. You can't, you need to get to level 8 to get the delayed blast Fireball, to get a Fireball that you can set up like a trap. Skull Trap, on the other hand, if you want to cast it straight into a pool of enemies or any characters, because it's not party friendly, just like Fireball, then you can do so and it'll explode immediately. Or you can stack Skull Traps in place and they won't proc right away until a creature encounters the trap. And that function is sort of buggy, but it does work most of the time in circumstances where an enemy appears or spawns in a certain area and the enemy is going to do so. If you load up that spot with Skull Traps, the Skull Traps will explode when the enemy appears. That's just more flexibility that you don't get with Fireball. So on spell deployment type, Skull Trap also has the edge over Fireball. Next to consider is damage type. Skull Trap does magic damage or magical damage, and Fireball does fire damage. We were talking a few minutes ago about how fire damage is the most commonly resisted type of damage, and it's so commonly resisted by the time that you get to TOB, you basically can't use fire damage as your bread and butter offensive or damage spells. Magical damage, on the other hand, and I think I covered this a little bit in the level 1 spell guide when talking about Magic Missile, which is another magical damage spell. But magical damage is the one damage type that's least commonly resisted. So spells that do magic damage like Skull Trap are immediately in the absolute best class of damage dealing arcane magic spells in the game. So Skull Trap, best possible damage type for magic. Fireball, absolute worst. Forgetting about all these other factors, that difference is so massive to scalability through endgame that just on that alone, Skull Trap becomes better. I would even take Skull Trap at a 8d6 damage cap versus Fireball at 10d6, given we're doing magic damage with Skull Trap. And then I think the last factor to consider when comparing these two things is that Skull Trap and Fireball is that Fireball has a lot of alternative spells that can replace the type of damage. There's Fire Wands, which do 66 damage and are instant cast. So the Fire Wand is actually better than Fireball through level 6. There's Agonizer's Scorcher. There's Sunfire, which is, I think, a better fire damage spell than Fireball. You have lots of different ways to create AoE fire damage. Magic damage, on the other hand, what you get via Skull Trap is very hard to create. You can't create it off of items except for maybe there's one or two rings or amulets that create magic damage in very small amounts, and then you have the Wand of Magic Missiles. But really, getting any magic damage in bulk, you're going to need Skull Trap. And Albi Dalzim's later in the game, but you need Skull Trap. So Skull Trap is really not replaceable, whereas Fireball, if you really need some fire damage for some reason, like to wipe out some trolls, or because you're fighting Kuotoans that take extra damage versus fire, you have items and wands to get you there. Not so for Skull Trap. So I think, to summarize, we looked at Fireball versus Skull Trap on almost every parameter that you could compare these two spells, and Skull Trap just comes out being clearly superior. We could have just stopped after we talked about damage type and resistances, and Skull Trap would have been better. But not only that, it goes up to 20d6 and all these other factors. When you add all that up, Skull Trap is just a superior spell, and you can't justify taking Fireball over it. I think the one time in the game when the two spells are roughly equivalent is in levels 7 to 10, when they're doing equal damage on paper, and at that point you're sort of late BG1 and you don't encounter enemies that have resistances yet. So in level 7 to 10, if you want to go with Fireball, by all means, you're not losing much versus Skull Trap. But that's really it. It's a 3-level span in BG1, and even at that point in the game, Skull Trap is about as good. So I think, to sum it all up, Fireball, yes, it is powerful when you get it. Yes, it is powerful through end BG1. No, it has no scalability really through the whole trilogy, and Skull Trap is clearly superior in the same level. So I'll say again, this spell's a pretty good spell on a standalone basis, but it's just overshadowed by better things in spell level 3. And for that reason, I'll rate Fireball a 3 out of 10. Next spell, it's another damage spell, Flame Arrow. Flame Arrow has a casting time of 3, area of effect of 1 creature, saving throw for half damage. And this spell enables the caster to hurl fiery bolts at opponents within range. Each bolt inflicts 1d6 points of piercing damage, plus 4d6 points of fire damage. Only half of the fire damage is inflicted if the creature struck saves versus spell. The caster receives 1 bolt every 5 levels beyond the 5th. 2 bolts at 10th, 3 at 15th, etc. All the bolts will streak toward the target of the spell. So this is a single target damage spell. Obviously, to justify single target damage spells, they have to be better than AoE spells in some way, where you have a chance to hit multiple targets. And just to talk about the mechanics of this spell in a bit more detail. Flame Arrow does scale to a max of 4 arrows at level 20. So like most spells, it cuts off at level 20. So when you're maxed out on this spell at level 20, in total, you're doing 4d6 piercing damage through the four physical arrows, and you're doing 16d6 fire damage with a save or a spell for half on the fire side. So that is, if you add it together, 20d6 total damage, which makes Flame Arrow scale better than Fireball. I think just going back to why Fireball is limited, this spell is actually doing more damage, significantly more, double plus when you consider the save mechanics, more than double damage than Fireball, although to a single target once you get to level 20 plus. And I think I always am intrigued by magic spells that deal physical damage. There's very few of them, and they can be situationally useful. So I always try to find a way or to make this spell work or want it to work. And what ends up happening is just underwhelming. I think this spell, like Fireball, suffers from the fact that it's just clearly inferior to the daddy damage spell at this level, Skull Trap. Skull Trap does better damage type. Magic damage is better than most of the damage from Flame Arrow being from fire, which, as we just went over, is commonly resisted. Skull Trap does about equal damage, scaling up to 20d6 at level 20. And it's worth noting that Skull Trap, like most other damage spells, will scale evenly with levels so that each level gained up to level 20 improves the spell. For Flame Arrow, you don't get an extra arrow until you're at one of these levels that are a multiple of 5, right? You have 1 at level 5, 2 at level 10, 3 at 15, and 4 at 20. So if you're at level 19, you're still doing 15d6 via the Flame Arrow to a single target, and you're level 19, so you're doing 19d6 via a Skull Trap. So Skull Trap does scale better. Obviously, Skull Trap is also AoE. It just begs the question, why would you ever cast this if your goal is just damage enemies? You're going to be better off with the Skull Trap. I think the only justification, if you're really looking hard for a reason for why this spell might be superior to a Skull Trap, is that the 4 different attacks, the 4 different arrows are coded into the game as 4 different attacks. So theoretically, if you're trying to whittle down an enemy's stone skin or mirror image, you're going to do so more quickly through Flame Arrow and its multiple attacks versus a Skull Trap and its single attack. But if you're facing a mage that is out of spell protections and just has a mirror image or a stone skin up remaining, there's going to be lots of different ways to whittle down or dispel that protection. You don't need Flame Arrow. You're going to be better off, just having a fighter focus on that mage for a couple rounds and then wiping the mage out with a Skull Trap. So there's really no justification I can think of to take this over a Skull Trap. Last note on this, one reason that physical damage spells are intriguing is the question of whether you can get them to hit during a time stop. And for example, you can do that with the priest spell Implosion, which is what makes Implosion, I think, the best single target damage spell in this game by far, and a really, really good spell, especially for cleric mages. But you cannot do that with Flame Arrow. Flame Arrow, because it creates a projectile, if you're in a time stop and improved alacrity, you can cast multiple of these and the arrows will appear stuck there in time and wait until the time stop expires to fly out to their enemies. That's sort of cool, but you can do the same thing with the Skull Trap and do more damage. So all in all, Flame Arrow, I always want to find a way to make it work because it's a cool idea, but it's just inferior to Skull Trap, full stop. Rating 2 out of 10. Next spell is Ghost Armor. Ghost Armor has a duration of 1 hour. a cast time of 1, area of effect of the caster, no save, because this is a buff you'd cast on yourself. By means of this spell, the wizard creates a magical field of force that serves as if it were field plate armor, AC 2. It is cumulative with dexterity bonuses to armor class, and in the case of fighter mages, with the shield bonus. The ghost armor spell does not hinder movement, adds no weight or encumbrance, nor does it prevent spell casting. It lasts until successfully dispelled or until the duration expires. So to recap, the duration, this is sort of the next phase of armor spells. There are 3 of them. You have armor at level 1, ghost armor at level 3, and then you have spirit armor at level 4. This spell lasts for an hour, so that's 5 turns, which equals 50 rounds or 5 IRL minutes. So that's usually going to be your entire in-game day. Really, if you're doing a lot of fighting, it's rare that you would be fighting straight for 50 rounds, or that you wouldn't be resting at some point inside 50 rounds inside a dungeon. At least maybe before you get to Wish in late game. So the duration is pretty decent. It's probably not long enough for an entire dungeon area, but most of it a decent duration overall. It's a super short cast time. Not really sure why that is. A cast time of 1. You could cast this in battle, but really this is not what you want to pop if you're in trouble in battle. Because it's just going to reduce your armor class and reduce your likelihood of getting hit, instead of protect you completely, like something like Mirror Image is more likely to do, or Stone Skin would be the ideal solution for that. So the cast time of 1 is sort of, a fake advantage of the spell. It seems like something good about it, but you'd never want to actually be casting this on yourself live in battle. You'd choose other buffs to protect yourself instead. Now let's just think about what this spell does and whether it's worth taking. First off, we got to remember that the level 1 spell, which I think I rated a 7 out of 10, a quality spell, Shield, gives you sets your AC to 4 and has the same exact duration as this spell, so 1 hour, plus it blocks magic missile. So really, the only advantage of Ghost Armor over Shield is an extra 2 armor class, or a 10% chance to prevent a hit on a D20. And you gotta ask, is an extra 2 armor class of improvement over Shield worth giving up a level 3 spell versus a level 1 spell? You can sort of guess where I'm going with this. I think the answer is clearly no. Clearly, 2 armor class, especially because armor class doesn't matter at all in later game. Enemy Thakos are all so low. 2 armor class is not worth giving up a level 3 spell slot over. Some justification for why I was just thinking about. If at high levels, Blur actually lasts longer than this spell. So Blur, at level 23, it's lasting an hour, and it lasts longer for every level above that. So if you're above level 23, Blur actually lasts longer. Blur is a level 2 spell, so a spell Wasteland and a lower level, and Blur gives -3 to AC and +1 to saves on top of it. So, a level 2, I guess that's to say a level 2 spell is doing better than what this spell does versus the level 1 spell Shield. And level 2 is a weak spell level. Level 3 is an awesome spell level where you have Skull Trap and Remove Magic and Haste and other awesome spells. So, I think there's just no justification to spend a spell slot in level 3 for 2 armor class. This is especially true because, as I said, in late game, Thako doesn't really matter. And because as a mage, your strategy to protect yourself from physical attacks is you need to minimize RNG and eliminate the chance that you're going to get hit as much as possible. And that's not by giving incremental boost to your armor class. That's by putting up a mirror image with with 5 or 6 mirror images that reduce the chance of getting hit to 15%. It's putting up a stone skin that reduces the chance of getting hit to 0 because the skin will absorb it. So this spell just doesn't fit into the best defense strategies for mages. At the end of the day, it's a 2 armor class improvement versus shield, and it's not worth taking. It does give you something, but what it gives you is not at all worth a level 3 spell slot. Rating 2 out of 10. Next up, Haste. The first of the really great, awesome level 3 spell selections. Haste has a duration of 3 rounds plus 1 round per level, a cast time of 3, area of effect of a 15-foot radius. There's no saving throw. And when this spell is cast, all creatures affected function at double their normal movement rate, gain a -2 initiative bonus, and receive an extra attack per round. Thus, a creature moving at 6 and attacking once per round would move at 12 and attack twice per round. At the instant the spell is completed, it affects all allied creatures in a 15-foot radius centered on a point selected by the caster. Thus, creatures leaving the area are still subject to the spell's effect. Those entering the area after the casting is completed are not. This spell is not cumulative with itself or with other similar magic. Spellcasting and spell effects are not affected. Note that this spell negates the effects of a slow spell. So what does this do? Haste is the best combat buff in the game before the level 6 spell Improved Haste, which we'll get to later and is even more busted and extremely strong. But the regular version Haste is a very strong spell. I think this type of Haste is the type of spell that explains why Arcane Magic is the strongest magic in the game when you compare it to other buffs and alternatives. A strong level 3, 4, 5 cleric spell is giving you maybe +2 to damage, +1 to damage, and everybody's getting excited about that. If there was a cleric spell that gave +3 to damage for your party, wow, that would be awesome. Now compare that to Haste. You get an entire extra attack per round for your entire party. And at the time you get this spell through when you have access to Improved Haste later, so the entire duration of when you'd use this, even if your party members are fighting that are dual wielding, that they're going to max out at 4, maybe 4.5 attacks per round. So you're adding on something like a minimum of 10% more damage per round. And for many characters in your party that have 1 or 2 attacks per round, you're literally doubling their damage output. If there's 1 attack per round, you're doubling their damage output. If they have 2, you're adding a third. So you're 50%ing on top of their existing damage output by casting this spell. So if a fighter's doing 20 damage per attack and you're moving that fighter from 3 to 4 attacks per round, you're adding 20 damage and a 33% damage increase on that character. That's insane. I mean, that's crazy. If there was a cleric spell that was called, Super Chant, and the effect was that each of your party members got a +20 to damage per round, you would look at that and say, that's stupid. That's totally overpowered. It's busted. It shouldn't exist. Like, why would I take any other cleric spell at this level? But that's what Haste is. It's that awesome. And I haven't even got to talking about the rest of the spell, which is that it gives a movement speed upgrade and it can cancel out slow. Both those things are useful. The movement speed upgrade is highly useful. You're probably able to get a lot more melee attacks in when your characters are flying around with Boots of Speed and Haste on. It's much easier to run from bad situations. You can dodge area of effect spells through improved movement speed. Movement speed is an awesome upgrade to have. I think to analogize to RTS games, often there are two types of upgrades in RTS games which most increase your unit's DPS. One of them is range upgrades for ranged units, and the other one is speed upgrades for either ranged or melee units. Because if the units can move more quickly, they're going to get significantly more attacks off, and the same is true in Baldur's Gate. If your party's flying around with haste, you're going to get a few extra attacks per round off that, on top of the +1 APR that the spell is giving to everybody. So, in summary, this is just a massive combat buff. It's powerful right when you get it, and it blows other combat buffs out of the water. So that's just all to say. This is a great spell. I think a few other things to highlight about Haste and talking about how it fits into the trilogy and scalability. There is some scalability here, given the +1 round per level duration. But realistically speaking, this spell is very powerful through late BG1 and through early to mid SOA before you get improved haste. By the time you get to Throne of Baal, you're much favoring improved haste, which is just an even more busted version. And many enemies will be hasted, perma hasted by the time you get to later fights, like fighting ball spawns, etc. So this spell, it does have some scalability, but really not through late SOA and TOB, when it's overshadowed by improved haste. It's sort of hard to decide how that should affect it. It's like how do you rate an excellent spell that only gets obsoleted by a super busted spell, right? But it does get obsoleted, and so it's not scalable all the way through end BG2 and TOB. I think the one exception to that, and the last note I'll make about the function of this spell is that because of the area of effect nature of this, obviously you only have to stock one of it, versus improved haste is a single target spell, and that makes haste really powerful when you're hasting not only your entire party, but also whatever summons you summoned. Hasted skeleton warriors, for example, will completely shred everything in Baldur's Gate 1 and a lot of things in SOA. Until your enemies are getting the sort of level 6 spells that insta-kill summons, hasted skeleton warriors are awesome, and you can get a bunch of them through casting one level 3 haste spell. The area of effect comes in handy there. So if you like playing with summons, then probably haste does have some utility all the way through the saga, because you're not going to be able to stock 10 different improved haste spells to individually haste all your summons. You're going to use an area of effect haste spell from level 3. So all in all, I think to summarize, this is just a massive combat buff, far better than anything in the cleric book. And the clerics are supposed to be the buff or support class, but instead mages get it. It's awesome when you get it in mid to late BG1. I think the first scroll that appears is in the Cloakwood Mines. It's useful as soon as you get it. It scales through improved duration as you level up, and it remains a great spell all the way through when you get improved haste, and at that point you'll switch to using improved haste. I'll give this spell an 8 out of 10. I think if it didn't get obsoleted, and if there weren't so many strong spells in level 3, I think this would be more like a 9. But there's just a lot going on in level 3, and this is not a spell that I end up using as soon as I get improved haste. As soon as I get improved haste, then I'm off this spell and onto the even more busted version. So taking that into account, an 8 out of 10 spell. Still a great spell. Next spell is Hold Person. Hold Person has a duration of 1 turn, a cast time of 3, And the area of effect is one creature and any enemy within 4 feet of that creature. A saving throw negates. This spell holds 1d4 humans, demi-humans, or humanoid creatures rigidly immobile and in place for 5 or more rounds. The hold person spell affects any bipedal human, demi-human, or humanoid of man size or smaller, including brownies, no idea what those are, dryads, dwarves, elves, gnolls, gnomes, goblins, half-elves, halflings, half-orcs, hobgoblins, humans, kobolds, lizardmen, nixies, orcs, pixies, sprites, troglodytes, and others. Thus, a 10th level fighter could be held, while an ogre could not. The effect is centered on the victim selected by the caster. Every enemy within 4 feet of the target is also affected. Those who save for a spell at a -1 are totally unaffected by the spell. Undead creatures cannot be held. And the last paragraph explains what held creatures can and cannot do. It's a stun. This is a stun, to summarize. The effect is a stun. I think I put hold person a little bit like Fireball and Lightning Bolt. It's in the camp of spells that are devastating when used against you, and they hit. So seem like they're super powerful, and hold person, God knows, is used against you by many of the toughest casters in BG1. But whenever I use the spell, enemies just save. Seems to have no effect. So, one of those spells that has a nasty effect, but a save or spell negates, and that means there's a lot of RNG. And I think, we'll talk about that type of spell more in a second. Just to summarize again, or go into a bit more detail on what this does. There is a -1 to saves penalty for enemies saving against this. That is what the saver spell at -1 means. It's not a bonus for enemies, it's a penalty for enemies, so that makes the spell a little bit better. And the duration at 1 turn is an eternity. 10 rounds, that's a very, very long time to be stunned. And again, when enemies are stunned, every attack will hit. So it's a powerful effect to put on your enemies. There is an AoE. It's a tiny AoE. It's possible to get more than one enemy in this if they're very clumped. The spell description does say that it holds 1d4, etc., 1d4 enemy creatures. But like Color Spray in level 1, which had a similar number of creatures affected limitation, that limitation does not apply here. It's actually possible to hold way more than 4 targets if they're clumped really, really close together. So I think, I guess that dynamic of this spell affects 1d whatever or a maximum of blah creatures, I think that was just never coded into the game, is my best guess. So that's why it's not actually a limitation on Color Spray, and it's not a limitation on Hold Person. That said, how good is this spell? Is it worth taking? I mean, just add this to the list, I think, of yet another crowd control spell that has a save or spell to negate. There's just countless numbers of these spells, and maybe it derives from the way that D&D works, but there's so many of these spells in the Arcane spellbook that have a save or spell against them, and if the enemy fails the save, then the spell will do something really nasty, all the way up to even outright killing the enemy, like Finger of Death. And if the enemy saves, then the spell will do absolutely nothing. If you like those types of spells, then you're going to find no shortage of them. I'll just list off a few: blindness, sleep, web, stinking cloud, grease, horror, confusion, chaos, polymorph other, feeble mind. You could keep going. There's probably 20 or 30 spells that are crowd control spells or insta-kill spells, and if enemies fail their save, then the spell is going to do something very nasty. I think stylistically, and I've been into this a little bit already, I do not favor using any of those spells just because I don't like the RNG of saves. I would prefer, for example, just casting a Skull Trap on an enemy, and Skull Trap has a save, but the save only halves the damage. So you know you're going to get something good out of Skull Trap. This spell, you have no guarantee you're going to get anything out of. And when you're in a fight and you only have 2 or 3 rounds to cast offensive spells that are going to dictate the entire course of the fight, I always favor guaranteed effects and damage over these types of save or spell crowd control spells. That's just style of play preference. I like to have predictability, and I like to kill enemies rather than taking a chance at disabling them. I think to get back to hold person specifically, I think the other aspect about there being so many of these different, if you fail your save, you're going to get crowd controlled or something bad's going to happen to you spells, is that it's really hard for spells of this type to distinguish themselves and be better than other similar spells. And the real spell that I usually go back to as a crowd control spell that others would have to be superior to justify themselves is Web, because Web is level 2. It does stun enemies. It's not party friendly, but it works over an area of effect, and it has a -2 penalty to saves. So on multiple fronts, the effect that it puts out, the fact that it's AoE, and the -2 penalty to saves, Web is a pretty damn good, if you fail your save, you're in trouble spell. And you get that at level 2, which is a wasteland, and where you can't take haste or any of these other amazing damage spells. So I think Web becomes sort of the limbo line, or the target that any similar spell would have to hit. And with this one, it's just yet another example of a crowd control spell that I can't see taking over Web, or I can't see why it's superior. It has a smaller area of effect, a smaller bonus to odds of the spell succeeding, or a smaller penalty at -1 versus Web's -2. It does the same thing, which is stun enemies. The duration's a little bit longer, but if an enemy's stunned, that enemy, you can dispatch that enemy in 2 rounds or 3 rounds. You don't need the 10 that this spell provides. And this spell is party friendly. I guess that's the only way that you could say it's better than Web. But again, and at level 3, we'll keep coming back to it. There are fantastic other spells to take instead of a spell that maybe is marginally better than level 2 Web on one parameter. I think if you're power gaming, you're clearly going to take damage spells at level 3, and if you want to crowd control enemies, you're going to leave that to Web, or maybe a blindness from level 1. So not a horrible spell, but just not worth taking relative to other options at this level, and suffers the same RNG problem as many other, if you save versus this, something bad's going to happen spells. I'll rate this a 2 out of 10 for Hold Person. Next up is Hold Person's ugly little sibling. If Hold Person was bad, then this is super bad. It's Hold Undead. Hold Undead is a necromancy spell. Its duration is 2 rounds per level, has a cast time of 3, and the area of effect is same as Hold Person. It's 1 creature and any enemies within 4 feet, with a saving throw to negate again. This spell holds 1d4 undead creatures rigidly immobile and in place. The effect is centered on the victim selected by the caster. Any enemies within 4 feet of the target are also affected. Those who succeed on their saving throws are totally unaffected by the spell. Held creatures cannot move or speak. Blah, blah, blah. That just explains what it is to be stunned. Okay, Hold Undead. Wow. All right, so, first, even just comparing this to Hold Person, there's fewer types of creatures that it affects, only affects undead. There's no save bonus. And I think there's, by the way, the 1d4 creature limitation is similar here. It does not actually work. It's not coded in. That makes a difference. This spell's horrible. And I think the main reason it's horrible, Hold Person wasn't very good to begin with, but at least there's a wide range of lower level creatures that spell might actually work on. For Hold Undead, most Undead are highly magic resistant. From the point that you start facing Skeleton Warriors in end of BG1 all the way through BG2, the entirety of BG2, and all of TOB, Undead creatures are generally pretty magic resistant. So you have here a spell that's designed to be used against Undead, but it has a save on it. And on top of that, many Undead that you would try to cast this against are going to just resist it. At the end of the day, the only enemies that this has a decent chance of stunning are like level 1 skeletons that you would meet around the High Hedge. And if you're a level 5+ party or a level 5+ caster, then you should just be eradicating those guys with Skull Trap or your level 5+ magic missile, not trying to disable them first. The spell, this is just a trash spell. There's a paradox in that the creatures it's intended to target will generally resist it, and it's bad. Never take it. 1 out of 10 rating. Horrible spell. Next up is Invisibility 10-foot radius. This spell has a special duration. The duration is really 24 hours, like the level 2 Invisibility spell. A cast time of 9, so not something you're doing in combat. An area of effect of a 10-foot radius, and there's no save, this being a buff. And I won't read the entire description because it's pretty simple to explain what this is. This is an area of effect invisibility spell. The same exact effect as the level 2 invisibility spell, but affects an entire area. And it does not work on enemies, so this is party friendly, if you will. And with that being said, the only real use case for this is that you want to get your whole party invisible. You want to get your whole party invisible to avoid a tricky area, to go around some enemies, what have you. Probably you're not casting this in battle to try to run away because of the very long cast time. I suppose you could, but not cast time of 9, almost an entire round. If you have that long to sit there and cast this spell, then you probably should just start running away. You're either not in trouble or, in a cast time of 9, your whole party could be across the entire map anyway. So you're really not casting this in combat. I'll go back to what I said earlier when I was sort of talking about ease of use spells during Clairvoyance. At the end of the day, this is just an ease of use spell, I think. Because of the difficulty of casting it in combat, you're really avoiding having to click multiple times with level 2 invisibility, and you're saving some invis potions through the spell. I just can't get too excited about this spell because of that. Yes, it does something good, but 5 invis potions or, 3 invis potions, 1 sanctuary, and 1 thief going into stealth will accomplish the same thing. 2 level 2 invisibilities plus 2 thieves going into stealth and 1 invis potion will do the same thing. So, all that said, it's just really hard to justify taking this spell over other spells in the excellent level 3 on a regular basis. It has situational use. I could see stocking it just to save yourself some clicks and casting it and then resting and retaining the invis and going on with your day. So it's not a garbage spell. It does have uses, but this isn't doing anything particularly powerful, especially considering the cast time of 9 versus cast time of 2 for the level 2 version, which really limits your ability to use this in combat. I'll give this spell a 3 out of 10. It does something, but nothing that can't be created through other means, and it does not stack up to the other excellent spells available in level 3.
Now we're on to Lightning Bolt. Lightning Bolt has a cast time of 3, an area of effect of the Path of Bolt, probably the only spell in the game with that area of effect, and saving throw causes half damage to be taken. Upon casting this spell, the wizard releases a powerful stroke of electrical energy that inflicts 1d6 points of damage per level of the caster, maximum damage of 10d6, to each creature within its area of effect. A successful saving throw versus spell reduces this damage to half, round fractions down. If the lightning bolt intersects with a wall, it will bounce until it reaches its full length. Yet another of these spells in level 3 that's one of the scariest things in the game when you see it coming at you, or when an enemy mage casts it at your party for the first time. And yet, when used by yourself playing the game, always seems to underwhelm. I think this is one of those maximum chaos or maximum random effects spells, just given that the bounce off walls mechanic is highly unpredictable. It's very difficult to predict which way a lightning bolt is going to fly off of a wall. And it always seems like incoming lightning bolts released by a trap or cast by an enemy mage will find a tiny nook to go back and forth over your party and cause 500 damage. And yet, whenever I cast the spell outgoing against another party, it seems to hit half the people once and then just fly off into the ether. So just a very unpredictable and random spell, and I've hit on this a lot throughout these guides. Randomness and chaos favors the game world. The game world has many non-player character enemies to throw at you and doesn't care if any of them die, whereas there's only one of you. There's only one ball spawn. So as the player of this game, you need predictability. You need spells that do guaranteed things, not spells that rely on randomness to be effective. And lightning is one of those spells. I think I won't go through the comparison again of this spell to Skull Trap, which is the gold standard for damage. Suffice to say that for all the same reasons as Fireball, plus the randomness of Lightning Bolt, Skull Trap is just far superior. Lightning Bolt also caps out at 10d6 like Fireball. Lightning Bolt is less commonly resisted. More enemies do take lightning damage in this game versus fire damage all the way through the end of the game. But I think all in all, the unpredictability of Lightning Bolt versus Fireball and the narrower area of effect, unless you somehow can figure out the trajectory of these things, which is impossible, makes Lightning Bolt inferior to even Fireball. It's definitely worse than Skull Trap by a wide margin for all the reasons articulated around Fireball, and I think it's even worse than Fireball. So I have to rate it accordingly. I could see, and I think about this from time to time, I could see doing a sort of for fun, like Zeus type build where you force yourself to only take damage spells that do electricity, like Chain Lightning, the Cloud spell that clerics get at level 7, and Lightning Bolt, and then you give yourself immunity from lightning damage. The Cleric Divine spell, level 4 protection from lightning, and go around having fun casting Lightning Bolt all over people and not caring if it bounces back at you because you're immune. But that's more of a for fun idea, not real power gaming, not something that will work in most playthroughs, and you're going to really suffer if you try to use this as your bread and butter damage spell instead of the twice as powerful Skull Trap. So this spell, highly unpredictable, very likely to kill your own party, worse than Fireball, way worse than Skull Trap, and I'll give it a 2 out of 10 rating. Next spell, Melf's Minute Meteors. This is going to be an interesting one. I feel like this spell I would put in the category of controversial spells. Views could differ widely on it. It's a spell that, since enemy mages rarely use it and it's less dramatic than some of the other level 3 spells, I feel like new players to the game underrate this spell and don't take it. But I've also heard it called the best spell in the entire game by people who are really smart and know a lot about this game, like Deveyorn and some other forum and Reddit posters. So I guess views on this spell range from literally the best spell in the game at level 3 all the way down to don't take it, not on the radar. And now let's dig in and see take an analytical approach and see where we come out. First, just going over the spell description. There's a cast time of 3. The area of effect is the caster, given that this creates a magic weapon. Doesn't work for anybody else except the caster. This spell creates several small globes of fire, one for each experience level the wizard has obtained, which are held in the wizard's hands in place of her usual weapons. The meteors can be hurled at targets up to 270 feet away and are treated as missiles with a +5 bonus to the attack rolls. Each meteor bursts into a 1-foot diameter sphere upon impact, inflicting 1d4 plus 3 points of damage plus an additional 3 points of fire damage to any creature struck. The wizard may hurl up to 5 missiles per round. So I think it's a hard spell to assess because this spell does have a lot going for it on paper. Just looking at the different effects that this has. These meteors, they strike as, I'll take Deveyorn's word for it. I think I saw a post, a comment on this, corroborating this online, but I didn't check it myself. They strike as +6 weapons, I think, so you can hit pretty much anything in the game with these. They provide a +5 bonus to Thaco, which makes a huge difference. We're talking about D20s when we're talking about Thaco, so that's 25% incremental probability to hit for a mage using these. And probably the most important combat effect that they do is that they set attacks to 5 per round, which is a huge jump up from the 1 APR that wizards will have. Non-dual classed or multi-classed wizards will only get 1 APR or 2 if dual wielding, which usually has too much of a negative Thaco effect for wizards to do. So you're setting yourself to 5 APR, giving a +5 bonus to Thaco, and each of these attacks is doing 1d4 plus 3 physical damage plus 3 points of fire damage. So not a huge amount of damage, but I think the point is, given the increase to APR and Thaco, this is one of the few spells in the game that can turn your mage into a decent fighter and allow your mage to do something useful in the time when the mage is not casting spells. The spell does cap out at 20 missiles at level 20, and you can combo this with improved haste to give yourself 10 attacks per round. There's a pretty fast cast time. The duration of 3 makes it an insta-cast with Robe of Vecna, so this can be cast during a fight to re-up on the missiles if you so choose. Let's just pause there and talk a little bit more about the exact amount of damage done. So the maximum damage is equal to 4 plus 3 plus 3 per missile. So 7 physical plus 3 fire per missile, which is 10 damage per missile. So all in all, when you add up total damage, if you're hitting every attack, when you first get access to this spell at level 5 and you're creating 5 projectiles, that's a maximum of 50 damage. Or by the time you get to level 20, you're creating a maximum of 200 damage. That's if you were to hit every single projectile and every single attack were to go for the full 1d4 plus 3 points of damage. And I suppose ignoring critical hits for this purpose. So that's single target damage, right? This is not AoE, but I think if you just compare this, if you're comparing this to what otherwise is the best damage spell in level 3, Skull Trap, that single target damage does compare favorably to Skull Trap. Skull Trap is 1d6 per level, so when you first get it, you're doing a maximum of 30 damage to creatures hit. And at level 20, when maxed out, Skull Trap does a maximum of 120 damage per strike. Both Skull Trap has saving throw to reduce damage by half, and with Melfs, you're going to need to make your attacks, and you're going to need to have you're going to need to roll somewhere on the 1d4. But high level, if you're comparing the 10 per missile or 10 damage per level that you get through Melf's Minute Meteors to the 1d6 that you get through, or the 6 max damage that you get through Skull Trap, this spell does compare favorably on a single target basis to the damage output from Skull Trap. So I think, all those things said, there's nothing here to really say that, given that it's single target, this spell is doing what it should be doing. It's doing more damage than the AoE alternative. Obviously, if Melf's Minute Meteors, you couldn't even get to higher damage output than Skull Trap, then it would be really hard to justify the spell. But you can. So, I think that's just to add to why this is, why some people say this is the best spell in the game and why this is a very viable spell. I think, though, that there are a few significant issues with making this spell, your primary focus as a mage. I think first you have to consider that this spell is 3 points of the damage that it's doing are fire damage, and at higher levels, almost every enemy is going to have fire resistance or complete immunity to fire damage. So once you get to higher levels where you really have 20 of these things, you're looking more at doing 1d4 plus 3 physical damage versus the 1d4 plus 3 plus 3. The same things that protect enemies against physical damage are going to protect them against this. Stone skins, protection from magical weapons, and so forth. And I think at high levels, really what being a mage is all about, if you're power gaming, is Robe of Vecna, Amulet of Power, Wizard Hat if you have it because you played Siege of Dragonspear, to reduce your cast time by 7, sort of breaking the time metrics of the game, and using improved alacrity to release as many spells as you possibly can through instant casting. And to take the alternative damage spell at this level, Skull Trap, if you're looking at pure single target damage, yes, you can do more damage to a single target in over 2 rounds of 10 APR Melf's Minute Meteors than you can with a Skull Trap. However, you're very rarely facing single enemies in this game. You're usually facing hordes of enemies or multiple enemies at the same time. And anytime you have a D20, a 20 D6 Skull Trap going off against multiple enemies, the Skull Trap is almost guaranteed to deal more damage than a single cast of Melf's will. And the Skull Trap will deal the damage instantaneously to multiple enemies at the same time, and can be cast instantly within a round with improved alacrity to unload up to 6 skull traps in a single round if you want. Obviously, for Skull Trap to hit, you're relying on enemies having decently low MR, but there are ways to
there are ways to reduce enemies' MR, and if you're using Melfs, you're similarly relying on enemies not having stone skins, mirror images, protection from magical weapons up. So I think both of these damage spells have ways that they can be countered, but fundamentally, in almost all situations, Skull Trap is going to be dealing more damage to more targets faster than Melfs. And you can get off multiple Skull Traps in a round with improved alacrity. So at very high levels, I never see myself taking Melfs over Skull Trap. I just think Skull Trap is far superior, and it plays well with the clear winning power gaming late game strategy for mages, which is reducing spellcasting time and using improved alacrity to unload your entire spell book and devastate enemies within a fraction of a round. Melf's Minute Meteors really does not play into that strategy well. So that's at high levels. I think at mid to low levels, you have to consider that you probably are only creating, you're creating 5 to 15 of these things. So you're going to get 2 to 3 rounds of attacks out of them. And maybe you have improved haste up, but that's just going to mean that you're using up the entire stock of these in an even shorter period of time. You probably can kill or interrupt casting on 1 or 2 enemies with improved haste and a single cast of Melfs in like late BG2 or mid BG2. But again, is that really going to turn the tide of a fight versus a 15d6 Skull Trap being dropped on a group of enemies, or hasting your entire party, giving your entire party an extra APR, which is going to add up to vastly more damage than Melfs creates? Probably not. Probably not. At least for my playstyle, I prefer to have those buffs versus give my mage some incremental power as a fighter. If you think that having 10 APR on missiles that have a high plus, that have low THAC0 and strike as, +4 or 5 plus weapons is really awesome, then I think you should probably just be playing with archers or fighters, which can get to 10 APR at higher levels with high enchantments on their weapons, because you have access to +3 and +4 arrows, bolts, etc. for those few fights where you need that high of enchantment. And you should just improve haste those fighters, and then they can go do what Melfs does every single round for 10 plus rounds, and that's just what the character does. If you think that is so game breaking to have 10 APR on ranged weapons, then just build a party that consists of 1 mage and a bunch of fighters. I think that party would get totally roasted by 6 mages using Skull Trap and Alacrity. But if that's the way you want to play, then fighters do this better than a mage casting Melfs.
The other thing that you can and should do, if you really believe that mages having attacks for 7 to 12 or 7 to 13 damage is really powerful with higher APR, is that you should get really into darts. And you should think that darts are a pretty decent weapon choice, because darts set your APR to 3 APR, regardless of your level and proficiencies. That can be increased to 6 APR with improved haste, or 4 APR with haste. You can head into the first level of Watcher's Keep and go, and I think you can just open up a chest, and the Crimson Dart +3, which is a returning +3 dart, is inside that chest in the first level of Watcher's Keep. So available from early SOA. You don't have to go to the tougher levels of Watcher's Keep. You can just loot the first level and get that +3 dart. If you think that having
5 APR with plus 5 to Thaco is super, super powerful, then you should definitely prioritize getting the Crimson Dart and plus 3 to Thaco and 3 APR or 4 with Haste. That's not that far off from the higher APR from Melfs. You should also prioritize getting the Cloak of the Stars from the Umar Hills quest, which allows you to create 6 plus 5 darts per day, which gets you the same Thaco bonus and enchantment, or close to same enchantment as Melfs, and will work against almost all enemies. There's very few enemies that require higher than plus 3 weapons to hit in the entire saga. Do people get super excited about darts on mages and talk about having 4 APR with haste and darts in BG1 that give you +1 or +2 to Thaco is super awesome and busted and really powerful? No, absolutely not. Because darts just don't do that much damage, just like Melfs doesn't do that much damage, and there's much more devastating things that you could be doing with your mage. So I think, all in all, if you compare to the alternatives that have similar physical damage dealing properties, like stocking up on fighters that do missile damage and have APR, or darts, it sort of gives the lie to the concept that this spell is super powerful. And I think the last thing to note is that casting this spell will remove your primary weapon as a mage. So if you're enjoying the plus to saves and the invisibility and protection from evil that you get from Staff of the Magi, for example, those protections are going to go away when you cast this spell. That's not the biggest deal in the world, but again, if you can do more damage via a skull trap and not take away those buffs, then I think the choice for me is clear which direction to go. So I think this is highly stylistic. If you enjoy getting your mages up to 10 APR without being a fighter mage, and you enjoy having 2 rounds of improved haste with 10 attacks per round where you can rapid fire down enemies, then go for it. Use this spell. The plus attacks are a real benefit. The plus to Thaco is a real benefit. But in my view, in early to mid game, I think haste is superior. The +1 APR is going to lead to more damage being dealt than these meteors would deal. And I also think that if just focused on dealing damage, then Skull Trap is the better choice in almost all situations. I don't know if there's much else to say here. I guess the last thing is I sort of went into this a little bit when talking about the relative power of improved alacrity and instant cast spells like Skull Trap. But even ignoring that dynamic, just the utility of Melf's Minute Meteors drops off on an absolute basis in late game, where enemies are going to have stone skins, protection from magical weapons up. They're almost all going to have immunities to fire. And also you're going to start to face enemies that have really low ACs that require fighter type Thacos to hit. And your mages aren't going to be able to do it, even with the +5 bonus to Thaco provided by this spell. So once you get into super late game, this spell just becomes a lot less useful. It is a nice spell to have situationally if you're focusing down or trying to interrupt mages. If you need to eliminate some highly magic immune enemies before you have access to a lot of lower resistance or pierce magic spells, then sort of through early to mid BG2, this can be a useful spell. And like I said, the fact that it strikes as a +5 or +6, the THAC0 bonus and the APR, those are real advantages. So I'm giving this a 5 out of 10. It's an okay spell. It can be quite strong in some situations. The late game utility drops off a lot and is clearly inferior to Alacrity plus Vecna plus Skull Trap. And I think just stylistically, if you believe that having 10 APR with ranged weapons is super busted, then you should actually not be taking this spell. You should be playing with 5 archers and 1 mage to cast improved haste on all of them and go take on all the enemies in the realm in that style. So rating 5 out of 10. Let me know why I'm wrong. Like I said, this is a really subjective one. This is a good spell. Really smart people who know a lot more about the game than I do think this spell is awesome. I don't think it's quite as good as the other options at level 3, and I tend not to use it very often, though acknowledge it's a decent spell. Let me know in the comments what you think on this one, and if I'm missing anything in my analysis here, because I do think this is this is one of the more interesting spells where reasonable views could differ. Minor Spell Deflection is the next spell. This spell has a duration of 3 rounds per level, a cast time of 3. The area of effect is the caster, and like most buffs, there's no saving throw. It's not really relevant. This spell is similar to the 6th level spell, Spell Deflection, which causes the spell cast against the wizard to be absorbed and consumed. This spell affects a total of 4 spell levels, including spells cast from scrolls and innate spell-like abilities, but excludes the following: area effects, blah, blah, blah. As long as the spell is cast directly at the wizard, it will be absorbed. This spell will only affect up to 7th level spells, but if it tries to absorb a spell that goes over its limit, the spell will fail and the spell deflection will be canceled. For example, if there's only 1 level left and a 3rd level spell is cast at the wizard, the spell will be absorbed while canceling the spell deflection. So, Minor Spell Deflection. This is one of the first anti-spell spells that you have access to as a mage. And there's 3 variety of these anti-spell spells. There's Spell Turning, which we're not talking about yet. Spell Trap, which is a special 9th level spell that we're not going to talk about for a long time. And then Spell Deflection, with this being the minor version of Spell Deflection. I did a whole post on Reddit, by the way, about how these 3 types of anti-spell spells interact and how it works when you have, for example, both Spell Deflection and a Spell Trap up. What gets hit first and so forth. I won't get into all that here. It's not really relevant for assessing this one spell, but I'll link that Reddit post in the comments here if you want to go check that out. I think the long and short of that post and the research I did there is that Spell Deflection will always be hit last if you have multiple of these types of defenses up. So if you have Spell Turning, Spell Trap, and Spell Deflection up, regardless whether it's major or minor of the Turning and Spell Deflection, the Spell Deflection will come last after the Spell Turning and Spell Trap have already been either dispelled or have been used up by defending magical attacks against you. To comment just on what Spell Deflection in particular does, it's called Spell Deflection. That's a bit of a misnomer. Really, it probably should be called Spell Absorption or Spell Blocking, because what this spell does is it will absorb and cancel spells that are cast directly against the wizard that cast this spell. So the spell description alludes to this, and I just did as well by saying spells cast directly against the wizard. This does not protect against AoE spells. So you, as the wizard that casts this, need to be specifically targeted by a targetable spell for the minor spell deflection to defend it. That's a really important point because a lot of the nastiest damage spells in this game, Skull Trap, Abidalzim's, Comet, Incendiary Cloud, all those spells are all AoE, and Spell Deflection will do absolutely nothing against those. Instead, what this spell does is it will absorb and cancel spells that are cast directly at the wizard that has this protection up. So, for example, a magic missile, a Melf's acid arrow. Probably the nastiest spell that this spell will counter and absorb is Finger of Death, because minor spell deflection only works on spells up to level 7. Now, minor spell deflection only deflects or affects a total of 4 spell levels. That's what the description says. However, if a spell cast against the wizard that's protected by this does strike, is higher than level 4 or higher than the remaining number of levels on the spell deflection spell, then that spell gets absorbed, even though it is more spell levels than the remaining protection. That's why, even though there's only 4 spell levels of protection inside here, a Finger of Death, a level 7 spell that's cast against a wizard protected by minor spell deflection, will still be absorbed and have no impact, because there's sort of a tail effect, which also applies if a level 4 spell is cast against the wizard while there's 1 level remaining on the deflection. A lot of jib jab to explain how this works, but these mechanics will come up again on the regular way spell deflection spell in level 7. I think the bottom line is that this spell is a way to defend yourself against your mage being targeted by nasty single target spells that are cast by enemy mages. This is the weakest form of that type of protection, absorbing only 4 levels and up to 7th level spells. But I think this spell still does have a use. It's the earliest spell that you get as a Arcane Magic user, for example, that can protect you from a Finger of Death or a Flesh to Stone. It's the first Swiss Army spell protection that can protect you against any number of nasty incoming effects that are single target. So I do think that this spell has some uses. It's giving you something at level 3 that no other spell is giving you. But that said, the number of spell levels of protection that you're getting here are very limited. You're probably better off just letting yourself get hit by a level 1 or 2 spell versus taking up a spell slot for this if you're in early game. And if you're in later game, you have lots of different immunities, like protection from magic energy, protection from fire, to better protect yourself against enemy casters. And I think, again, to reiterate it, this spell does not protect you against AoE, which sort of makes it useless for some of the nastiest damage spells in the game. All that said, there is a use for this. It does have some function. You get access to it pretty early in the game for this type of spell protection. I'll give this spell a 3 out of 10 rating. The following spell is Monster Summoning. Monster Summoning lasts for 2 rounds plus 1 round per level, has a cast time of 4, and with the casting of this spell, the wizard summons a random selection of 3 HD monsters. There's a 60% chance of receiving 1 monster and a 40% chance of receiving 2 monsters. The monsters appear within spell range and attack the spellcaster's opponents until the spell duration expires or until they are slain. This spell, in one word, barf. You finally get a summon spell. If you're a conjurer, I feel bad for you. If you're a conjurer, you finally get a summon spell all the way at level 3 spellcasting, and it completely sucks. These spells were good in vanilla Baldur's Gate. They summon much stronger monsters, many more monsters.
They were nerfed in Baldur's Gate 2 and now are completely useless. And this is sort of the beginning of a theme for mage summons. There are so many different summons in the Arcane spellbook. It's sort of like these save versus spell crowd control or single target spells. There's just infinite variety of them, and so many of them are horrible, clearly inferior to other spells, and get you near nothing. Summons are very similar. There's only a few of them, which we'll get to, that are good, and this is absolutely not one of them. So let's look at what you actually get through this spell. You're going to get 1 to 2 3 HD, so 3 hit die monsters. And what can those monsters be? You're either going to get a kobold commando, a wild dog, a ogrelon, or a warg. So these are all super, super low level, weak monsters that are what you're fighting from level 1 in BG1. Why do you need to get to level 3 magic to get access to a summoning spell that gives you 1 to 2 level 1 monsters that have no resistances, bad Thakos, and few attacks per round? I have no idea. In general, without resistances, summoned creatures are pretty useless. They're just going to die to all of the AoE spells and physical damage that's flying around all over the place when you're in the thick of a fight. And that's especially true when you're talking about such weak monsters as this selection. In addition, I feel like I'm just going through a parade of reasons why this spell's horrible, but the other thing you'd have to compare this to is, and I always do this when there's a wand available that does the same thing. There's, of course, the Wand of Monster Summoning available. You can get it from level 1 in Baldur's Gate 1 in the Tombs area. That is also the exit to the National Mines. Just pop a Invisibility Potion or an Invisibility spell, run in and grab that Wand of Monster Summoning. And that wand is quite a powerful wand, especially at low levels, at very low levels, because it actually summons 12 HD of monsters versus 3 to 6 from this spell. The wand is an instant cast. Those monsters from the wand survive for 2 turns, so that's 20 rounds of monsters. For reference, Monster Summoning 1 would only last that long if the mage casting it is level 19 or higher. And if you're level 19 or higher, in late SOA to early TOB casting Monster Summoning 1, God bless, something's gone very wrong. And on top of that, the Wand of Monster Summoning summons stronger summons such as Ogre Berserkers, better summons that are available than are what are available from this spell. So to summarize, the spell's horrible on its face, summoning super weak monsters that die instantly, that are level 1 monsters that you laugh at by the time you even get access to the spell. The spell is worse than a wand that's available from level 1. It's worse in every single way. There's not a single way that this spell is better than the wand. So that means that there's just no reason to ever take this spell. It's insulting how horrible it is. It's insulting for conjurers how horrible it is. This I guess if there's one spell we've talked about so far that I wish I could rate lower than a 1, it might be this spell, just because of the potential of what it could be versus the crap that you get. I rate this a 1 out of 10. This is truly one of the worst spells in the game. Monster Summoning 1. Next spell is Non-Detection. Non-Detection has a duration of 4 hours, a cast time of 3, affects 1 creature, and by casting this spell, the wizard makes the creature touched undetectable by divination spells such as Clairaudience, which doesn't exist in this game, Clairvoyance, which doesn't detect people or creatures in this game, Locate Object, which doesn't exist in this game, ESP, which does not exist in this game, and detect spells including Invisibility Purge. Okay, that exists. It also prevents location by such magical items as crystal balls and ESP medallions, which do not exist in this game. It does not affect the no alignment spell. Oftentimes when spell descriptions talk about a bunch of stuff that doesn't exist in the actual implemented game mechanics, it means that the spells are not very good. And that is true for this spell, for non-detection. For the longest time, honestly, until I really researched this video, I didn't fully understand what non-detection is. And when I went to actually research it for this video, I found out that it's extremely underwhelming. And that's probably why I never read much about it or focused on it in years of playing the game. What this spell does is that it protects against the level 2 detect invisibility spells, invisibility purge, and detect invisibility. That's all it does. Those are the only spells that it protects against. Those level 2 invisibility dispelling spells. Higher level anti-illusion spells and anti-invis spells such as Oracle, True Sight, or even Dispel/Remove Magic will still take down invisibility even if you have cast non-detection. So the only thing that this spell is useful for is if you invis yourself through invisibility, improved invis, shadow door, etc. And then you take another round to cast non-detection on yourself. Then, if you happen to be facing like a level 4 to 6 enemy mage who only has access to invisibility purge and detect invisibility as a means of dispelling your invisibility, this spell will keep your invisibility up despite those level 2 spells being cast against you. You know, whoop-de-doo. I can't really think of enemy mages that even fall in that category that would not try to dispel you and instead try to cast level 2 detect invis spells against you. Obviously, once you get to BG2, all the enemy mages and clerics are using True Sight, so this spell will be a complete waste of a spell slot, will do absolutely nothing. Even by the final fight in BG1, Saravok's mage companion there is casting Dispel or Remove Magic on you, as opposed to detect invisibility spells. If you get hit with a Dispel, again, non-detection will do absolutely nothing. It'll just be dispelled along with your invisibility. So just can't think of a specific use case for this. In theory, this could be powerful if it blocked things like True Sight, but it does not. So this spell, it does something. It has a theoretical use. It would be pretty cool if there was ever a fight. People tell me if you know of one where the enemy mage only has access to these level 2 spells and you could go clown on that mage through non-detection. If that exists, it's pretty rare. So the spell does something. It's just extremely situational and has no use past mid BG1. A rating of 2 out of 10. Next spell is Protection from Cold. Protection from Cold is an abjuration spell. It lasts for 1 turn per level, cast time of 3, area of effect 1 creature, and what this spell does is it confers immunity to cold attacks and cold damage. The spell description is very misleading by concluding with the statement that it absorbs 50% of all the damage dealt by magical cold sources. In reality, the game will show you a resistance to cold separate from resistance to magic cold in your resistances screen, but there's no spell or effect that distinguishes between regular way cold damage and magic cold. They're all regular way cold damage. So this concept of magical cold seems to be something that maybe it's in the D&D rule set, and there's similar concepts for magical fire, magical acid damage. Maybe these concepts were in the D&D rule set, but they didn't make it into the final game other than these spell descriptions. So thankfully, this spell is a little bit stronger than you might suspect just based on the description, because it does confer 100% invulnerability or 100% resistance to cold damage, and that's regardless the source of the damage. A spell including Cone of Cold,
cold damage that's on top of an attack, like a Winter Wolf's attack. It doesn't matter what the source is. This spell is going to give you 100% resistance to that cold damage. And it does last 1 turn per level, so that's 1 in real life minute per level, which scales to level 20. So at level 20, you get 20 IRL minutes out of this, which is functionally an entire day in the game, and you're probably going to be resting for other reasons before this protection would ever wear off. I think I'm going to end up talking a lot about this spell just because I'm going to pause here and go into a long discussion about resistances and what they do for you and why to focus on them, how to get them, because I think to really assess the value of this spell requires answering those questions. Why are resistances important, and how should you get them on people on your party, including your mage? And this, it seems like a theme of level 3. Level 3 spells are raising some higher level, more complex game mechanics, and this is one of them. Resistances is one of them. So I need to get into resistances to talk about the value of this spell now that we're into some of the big boy spells in level 3. So resistances are super important in this game, especially as you get into TOB. They're useful in BG1. They start to become very important in BG2, and then in TOB, resistances to different types of damage are extremely important because you face a lot of enemies that do insane amounts of elemental and other magic damage against you, whether it's fire giants with their fire attacks or enemy mages spamming out Abidal Zeems against your party. Resistances are the best answer to those types of damage. Of course, there are other types of spell defenses. We talked about an example earlier in minor spell turning, and you do have protections like Stone Skin and Mirror Image to throw up. So why care about resistances when you have access to those other spell protections? Well, the simple answer is that none of those spell protections, spell turning, spell deflection, spell trap, or mirror image, none of those different protections will protect you against area of effect spells. So that's the major first answer. Those spells will only protect you against attacks targeted specifically at you or spells targeted specifically at you that are single target spells. So, those defenses have their function in protecting you against enemy magic, but many of the most devastating elemental and other damage types in this game come through AoE effects. Those protections will also not protect you against elemental or other damage that is associated with a physical attack, right? If you have mirror images up or a stone skin up and a fire giant or fire elemental is attacking you that has plus fire damage on top of their physical attack, the fire damage is going to go through the stone skin or the mirror image. And similarly, a spell turning, spell deflection, or spell trap will protect you against single target spells being cast against you, but will not protect you against add-on damage to physical attacks. So those are two major ways that you can get damaged in this game. The scarier one being AoE, because AoE spells and elemental damage effects do a ton of damage in this game. Those two modes of damage, by far the most effective way to protect yourself against those types of damage is through stacking elemental and other resistances on your characters that will nullify or reduce that damage. The other option for AoE spells would be spell immunity spells, which you get access to at level 5. But spell immunity is pretty impractical for avoiding all the different AoEs because those AoE effects come from different spell schools. So you'd have to be casting a lot of spell immunities on your entire party. And also, spell immunity doesn't protect you against the add-on elemental or magical damage to different physical attacks. Resistances will do that. So resistances become super important, especially in TOB, There's going to be enemies that do a ton of physical damage, from which you still need protection, just like you need protection against physical damage from enemies through the entire saga, especially as a spellcaster. But the amount of elemental and other magical damage being thrown at you, especially through AoE spells, gets crazy, and the way to manage that is through resistances. So we know that resistances are important to avoid dying, and the question is, how do you acquire them as a mage? Well, I think the spell that jumps out as my personal, and we'll get to it later when we're discussing higher spell levels, but it does play into level 3 and assessing these protection spells in level 3. The spell that jumps out is the 7th level spell, Protection from the Elements, because level 7, as we'll get to, is a relatively weaker spell level without awesome damage spell that you're going to want to load up the level on, meaning that you sort of have some more flexibility as to what you take at level 7. And Protection from the Elements at level 7 gets you 75% resistance to fire, cold, and electricity damage, which are the most common forms of elemental damage. If you're a fighter mage, then you could then tack on Helm of the Rock or Gift of Peace, which would get you to 95 to 100% resistance when stacked with Protection from the Elements. If you're a cleric mage, which I really enjoy playing, probably enjoy it more because I play with XP cap removers, in which case cleric mages get insanely powerful. But if you play with cleric mage, then you can add high level Armor of Faith to Protection of the Elements from the elements and get to 100% resistance across fire, cold, and electricity through that 2-spell combo. So generally speaking, I'm usually taking Protection from the Elements and then comboing that with items to get to maximum resistances. And I find that that's the best combination of defense and not taking up a ton of spell slots to get resistances on my mage and other members of the party, just because the level 7 spell will get you 75% to all 3 with 1 spell slot in a level that's not totally stacked. So no, that's long term. That's generally my strategy. Maybe I'm going to underrate these level 3 protection spells for that reason. But in my experience, the 75% reduction is pretty effective. So I just wanted to explain my thinking around that. Generally speaking, I am relying on a combo of items, Armor of Faith, and Protection from the Elements to get to maxed out resistances on elemental damage, rather than casting 4 or 5 different resistance spells on myself. Of course, you need to have 100% resistance to magic damage, I think, for many reasons as a mage. We'll get to that later when we get to level 6 and Protection from Magical Energy. I left that out in this discussion. I do think that's always worth protecting yourself 100% from. But that spell is not a level 3 spell. What we have here in level 3 is Protection from Cold, this spell, and the very next one, Protection from Fire. So returning to this spell in particular, after getting away from talking about resistances generally, Protection from Cold, this is really highly situational in the entire saga. There's just not that many enemies that do cold damage to you. You have the Winter Room in Durlag's Tower. You may be choosing to try to kill the good Ice Dragon Adelon in the Underdark. There's also a cold room in the elemental level in Watcher's Keep. Those are the main examples I can think of cold using enemies that are super scary. Because you also have things like ice salamanders in Throne of Ball. Those are generally thrown in with a bunch of other types of enemies and are not super scary. So I can't think of there are only a handful of fights in the entire game where you're going to be facing so much cold damage that it's really important to have 100% resistance to cold. And there's no nasty traps that do cold damage. That's really important too. Fireball and electricity traps are God, they are the killers in BG1. Those are the traps that are going to one-shot you or your party and are extremely scary. But there's no cold equivalent. So that reduces the utility of this protection from cold spell. In addition, you don't really need this spell because you do have access to potions of protection from cold and the green protection from cold scrolls that you could cast off of to protect yourself from cold damage. The 50% resistance from the potions and the green scrolls does stack. So without ever using this spell, you can still get to 100% cold resistance on your entire party for those limited fights, without taking up level 3 spell slots. So in summary, situationally, this spell could be useful. At higher levels, I find myself relying on protection from the elements and items to get to near 100% cold resistance, which is fine to survive the random ice salamander or cone of cold that might get thrown at your party. And otherwise, this is just highly situational given the limited amount of cold damage in the game, and you have items that could protect you there instead of this spell. So this spell does do something. Resistances are great, but very limited use cases. I'll give it a 3 out of 10. Next up is protection from fire. Protection from fire has all the same exact dynamics as protection from cold, which we just talked about, the same duration, and it has the same dynamic that it actually gives you 100% resistance to fire damage and this on paper 50% resistance to magic fire, but as mentioned, there's really no such thing in practice as magic fire damage. So the impact of this spell is to give you 100% resistance to fire damage, full stop. And it has the same nice duration of 1 turn per level. So this is an all-day spell. If you have 3 party members and you have 3 casts of this, your whole party is going to be immune to fire all day.
What is it?
I think this spell there's a much better case for taking this even at higher levels when you have access to protection from the elements versus protection from cold, just because fire damage is just so common. From low levels, you face it when you go against enemy mages in BG1 that love to cast fireball, those nasty fireball traps that seem to be in every dungeon, and I always forget where they are. There's lots of enemies like Helmed Horrors in BG1 that do a little bit of fire damage in addition on top of their regular attack. So fire damage is everywhere in BG1. By the time you get to BG2, you have enemies casting Incendiary Cloud against you, and then in Throne of Ball, you have Incendiary Cloud. You have, if you're playing with SCS, enemy mages using Comet and Meteor, Comet and Dragon's Breath rather against your party, and the damage output is insane, and it's all fire damage. On top of that, there's also many more fire damage spells that you might want to cast as a mage that are powerful spells, but you wouldn't want to stand in the area of effect of without being 100% plus fire resistant. That's not the case for cold, right? The only real cold damage spell that's any good or would be worth considering in the mage's arsenal is Cone of Cold, and that shoots out from the mage, away from the mage. It's not an AoE. Whereas with fire spells, you have Fireball if you want to use it, if you just like it over Skull Trap for some silly reason. You have Incendiary Cloud, which does a lot of damage over time and is a decent spell worth considering. And I'm sure I'm forgetting 1 or 2 spells that are not party friendly and do fire damage in the game. That would be an additional reason why fire resistance is much more valuable than cold resistance in this game. So, in summary, fire damage is the most common elemental damage in the game, and that being the case, it's pretty useful to have 100% resistance to it instead of just the 75% that you'll get through the level 7 protection from the elements spell. So you could use items, but there's probably not an item in the ultimate kit for mages that includes some incremental fire resistance. So you'd have to sort of sacrifice something else to get fire resistance through an item. You're taking Ring of Gax and maybe a Ring of Protection +2 or something like that when you're at, or the Warder's Signet for +3 when you're at super high levels as a mage, or maybe a Ring of Acuity. You're not going to want to give up Ring of Acuity or +3 to saves if you don't have to, in exchange for taking a Battleistas Passport to get your fire resistance up to 125 on top of the level 7 spell. Or you're just giving up something if you choose to do that. So taking this spell is a nice alternative to that. And then when you're at lower levels, of course, you don't have level 7 protection from the elements. You just have potions, and you can get a fire resistance ring late in BG1, but you want fire resistance much earlier than that, or an enemy mage or fireball trap is going to one-shot you and kill you. So when you first get this spell, it's really the only good option for fire resistance, and that remains the case through all of BG1 and then early to mid BG2 before you have a ton of level 7 spell slots and feel like taking protection from the elements is comfortable there. So in summary, regardless how focused on elemental resistances you are, this is the most important one to have other than protection from magical energy. You get it at level 3. The spell lasts a long time, so you only have to have one spell slot for it if you're just protecting yourself or you're soloing. And this is going to save your ass many, many times. Really strong spell. I think the only reason not to rate it higher is because you do have the option of protection of the elements and items later on. And as we know, level 3 has a bunch of great spells in it. So I give this a 7 out of 10. A quality spell throughout the saga. Next spell is Protection from Normal Missiles. This spell has a duration of 1 hour, a cast time of 3, an area of effect of 1 creature, and by means of this spell, the wizard bestows total invulnerability to non-magical hurled and launched missiles such as arrows, bullets, darts, throwing axes, and throwing daggers. Note, however, that this spell does not convey any protection from such magical attacks as fireball, lightning bolt, or magic missile, nor does it protect against magical missiles such as arrows +1. Well, it's a spell that in theory, I guess if you're a level 1 or level 2 mage, sounds pretty powerful, right? Protection from normal missiles. In early BG1, ranged weaponry can kill you very easily as a mage, so you have to be careful and avoid those types of fights. Of course, this is not a spell that you get access to very early in BG1. This is a spell that you get access to only at level 5. And by that point, you're much better off, I think, relying on mirror images and improving your armor class as much as you can to avoid getting hit by ranged weapons versus stocking this spell. The main reason is that pretty soon, by mid BG1, you're starting to fight enemies that if they do have ranged attacks, they're carrying arrows +1. They're carrying magic arrows that can hurt you even if you cast this spell. So really, this is only useful against the lowest of the low-level enemies in BG1. And as I said, to take on those enemies, you have things like the Boots of Avoidance, which you get in the Nashkel Mines. You have Mirror Image. You have Blur. You have the Cloak of Displacement, which you can buy from level 1 in Olgoth's Beard. There's lots of different solutions to get super low AC against missile attacks, plus Mirror Image's ability to tank some hits that will adequately protect you against low-level enemies until you're facing enemies with +1 arrows or more, and this spell would be of no use anyway. So, of course, this spell has absolutely zero utility by late BG1 all the way through BG2 or TOB when every enemy that's attacking you with a magical attack is going to be using +1 projectiles. So 0 scalability. There's maybe a couple fights like the bandit camp where you're facing a lot of low level enemies with normal ranged weapon attacks where this could be helpful to you. But there are better, more versatile solutions to those couple fights. So even for the poster child use case for this spell, it's just one of a few different viable options, I think. So not a very strong spell, absolutely 0 scalability, and I'll give this spell a 2 out of 10 for protection from normal missiles. The next spell that we have here is Remove Magic, and this one is going to be a long one. That's worth a lot of discussion, just because it's a complex spell and a controversial one probably, and one that I have a decent amount of thoughts on. So I'm going to actually read the whole description because it gets into, with pretty good specificity, the different probabilities here, which are important, really important to understanding this spell. So Remove Magic is an abjuration spell with a cast time of 3. It operates over an area, a 15-foot area of effect radius, and there's no saving throw, although it does have a probabilistic chance to succeed, which I'll go through now by reading the description, and we'll get into it in more detail after that. This is the combat version of Dispel Magic. It will only affect opponents. A Remove Magic dispels the magical effects upon any enemies within the area. This includes effects given from spells, potions, and certain magical items such as wands. It does not, however, affect enchanted magical items. The chance of the dispel succeeding is determined by the level of the caster and the level of the magic being dispelled. The base chance of successfully dispelling is 50%. For every level that the caster of Remove Magic is above the original caster, her chance of success increases by 5%. For every level that the caster of Remove Magic is below the original caster, her chance of success decreases by 10%. However, despite the difference in levels, there is always at least a 1% chance of success or failure. Thus, if a caster is 10 levels higher than the magic she is trying to dispel, there is only a 1% chance of failure. Similarly, if the caster is 4 levels lower than the magic she is trying to dispel, there is only a 10% chance of success. Intuitively, this spell is almost useless if the target is 5 or more levels higher than the caster. Note, while this spell dispels the individual effects of Grease, Web, Stinking Cloud, and other such spells, it does not dispel the area of effect. Okay, so this spell description actually does a pretty good job of describing how this works and the probabilities of success. I think the first thing to say is that this is a unique odds of success dynamic that is unique to Remove Magic and Dispel Magic. There's nothing else in the game that operates on this basis of comparing spellcaster levels. So sort of a special case. And these two spells are also special in other ways that we'll get to later on. Let's just talk, before we get into the probabilities, let's just talk about what this does if it succeeds. So first of all, Remove Magic can be cast over an area of effect, and that means that the probabilistic check to dispel is going to occur once for all of the set of cleric spells that's affecting each of the targets within the AoE, and once for all of the set of mage spells that's affecting each of the targets within the AoE. And it's a separate check target to target. So a separate roll, if you will, for each target within the AoE. If the spell is successful, if the dispel is successful, then Remove Magic will dispel the most protections or buffs of any single cast spell in the game. Dispel Magic obviously is the same effect, but this is superior because it's party friendly, so it's only going to impact your enemies and you can cast it in the thick of battle. What does this dispel? It dispels Stone Skin, Fire Shield, protection from magical weapons, protection from the elements, protection from energy, all of those combat protections are going to immediately go away if this is successful. This spell does not dispel spell protections like spell trap, shield, deflection, turning, minor or major globe of invulnerability, or spell immunity. On the other hand, other than spell immunity abjuration, none of these protections will block the dispel. There's just no interaction. So whereas, spell shield will block a breach, a pierce magic, etc. It will not block remove magic.
Now, to talk about how remove magic interacts with illusion spells for a minute, it's similar to those spell protections in that remove magic can be cast in an AoE against enemies that are protected by illusion spells such as invisibility, improved invisibility, mislead, project image, mirror image, etc. Remove magic can be cast in an AoE against those enemies because it doesn't need to be targeted. So unlike breach, which has to be targeted on the enemy, meaning the enemy needs to be out of invisibility, remove magic can just be targeted on the area. And similar to the spell protections, remove magic will not actually remove the illusion protection, but it will still have the same dispel effect on all the combat protections that invis or illusion protected creature has up. So as an example, if there's a mage that has improved invisibility on, you can cast remove magic on the area where that mage is standing and have remove magic successfully dispel all the combat protections on that mage while leaving the mage still invisible. The one nuance to this is that if the mage does have a project image or a mislead up, then the remove magic will actually dispel the image that's projected. So that misled image or the project image cannot cast spells against you if you successfully dispel it, because it'll just be dispelled from the game. The original caster will remain in invis though, since remove magic does not actually bring enemies out of invisibility. So I think the summary of how this interacts with other spells is this spell has all the effects that Breach, the level 5 mage spell, does of removing combat and other protections on enemies. It can be cast against invisible enemies using the area of effect feature, and although it will not bring those enemies out of invisibility, it will dispel their combat protections, and it will also dispel their misled images or projected images. And it's not blocked by spell shield. It's only blocked by spell immunity abjuration, which in SCS certain enemy casters will cast on themselves, but in the base game, which I'm focused on here, virtually no or literally no enemies will cast spell immunity abjuration on themselves, meaning that this spell will work against all or almost all enemies in the base game. And as we were talking about earlier, the spell protections that this does not interact with and would not dispel, like spell trap, spell shield, spell deflection, or spell turning, those protections don't protect against AoE. So it's a pretty good tactic with remove magic to first remove all of the elemental and other spell protections other than the ones I've just listed from enemies with this spell, and then you can blast those enemies with AoE effects, and they're going to have no protection against those AoE effects, even if they still have their spell trap up or spell turning up. Minor and major globe of invulnerability will still give enemy mages protections against AoE spells, but minor and major globe cannot protect against higher level AoE damage spells like Abidalzim's. So it's a super effective tactic against enemies that have a lot of protections up, even invisible enemies, to simply cast remove magic on the area that they're in, thereby stripping them of their protections against magical damage or
other AoE damage spells, and then hit them with high-level AoE damage spells, that's guaranteed damage against almost any enemy in the game, unless they have, undispellable immunities. And that works regardless how many protections those enemies have up initially. Very powerful combination. So I think to summarize, this is the most powerful debuff in the game when it goes off. There's really no debate over that. Breach is equally as effective at dispelling combat protections, but Breach is single target, not AoE. Breach therefore cannot be cast against invis enemies, whereas Remove Magic can. And Breach is also subject to being blocked by Spell Shield, which enemies in this game do use, and especially in SCS, enemies do use Spell Shield. So if you compare using Remove Magic to Breach as a debuff, well, with Breach, first you need to cast True Sight against an invis enemy, wait for the True Sight to bring the enemy out of invis, then you need to cast maybe a Ruby Ray to eliminate their spell protection. And then only on the third round of your spell casting can you actually cast Breach and remove the enemy's spell protections. That's 3 rounds of casting very high level spells just to take care of one enemy target. If you compare that to Remove Magic, you don't care if the enemy's invis. You just fire off one spell, Remove Magic. It's going to go around the spell shield. It's going to dispel their combat protections even if they're invised. And then you can spend the next 2 rounds casting Abidel Zims and completely wrecking the enemy instead of continuing to need to bring down their spell protections. And of course, this tactic can be effective against the entire group because of the AoE nature of Remove Magic. So if Remove Magic is effective, it's just way quicker and way more deadly at ripping down enemy protections than the alternative of first dispelling illusion spells and then casting a Breach. Or if the enemy has a spell shield up, you would first need to remove the illusion spells, then cast a spell like a warding whip or something, or a Ruby Ray that's going to remove the spell shield, and then you could cast the Breach thereafter, or you could cast 2 Breach spells. So in summary, Remove Magic removes a ton of nasty buffs that your enemies can have up, the largest suite of debuffs or buff removals that exist in the game from a single spell. And also it can do so in one go and not be blocked by spell shield versus potentially needing to cast 3 higher level spells to get there through other means. It can't be emphasized how powerful that is and what a Swiss Army knife that is to avoid needing to go through 3 rounds to get through your enemy's combat protections, and instead be able to rip them down through one level 3 spell that is a cast time of 3. 3 rounds when an enemy mage is casting spells could be the difference between life and death for your party, because enemy mages are so deadly. They can be throwing out a time stop during one of those rounds, or multiple Abidel Zims against your party. Speed is at a premium when taking out enemy spellcasters, and this spell achieves that in a way that higher level debuff spells do not achieve. It's a very deadly spell when it goes off. So I think another way to look at this is like an AoE Breach, which goes around Spell Shield and can be used through Invisibility. If you believe that Breach and other higher level debuffs are strong spells, which they are, then I think you have to give Remove Magic serious consideration and believe that when it does proc, it's one of the most powerful spells in the game in turning fights your way by debuffing enemies. So I think all that is just to make the point that this is, when it goes off, the best debuff in the game. It's a Swiss Army knife that gets rid of many different types of protections all in one go. And for that reason, it has to be taken really seriously as a strong spell throughout the saga. Now, let's talk about probability of succeeding with this spell. Obviously, I've said it many times, if you're power gaming, or my philosophy about trying to play this game without dying and at higher difficulties, is you have to prioritize sure things over probabilistic chances. That's why I'm always favoring damage spells over save versus spell crowd controls. That's why Stone Skin is, we're going to get into it in level 4, but it's fantastic versus armor class changing spells that only give you a chance to avoid hits. That sort of defines an entire way of looking at magic in this game. Is the stronger spells give you 100% chance of dealing damage or protecting yourself. This spell does not do that. Admittedly, it does not do that. If you always want 100% certainty, then that's the only criterion you look at to judge how strong spells are, then you're not going to use remove magic, because it is probabilistic. It's always probabilistic, no matter what level you are. You're going to always focus on using breach and other sure thing spells, even if it takes you 4 times as many spell slots and 3 times as many rounds to cast that stuff. I think, though, that would be just a too simplistic way to look at the game. Although I favor predictability, when the effect of something is so powerful that it can turn the entire fight your direction if it goes off, then we got to take a closer look at probabilities. So let's do that. I think the first thing to point out about this spell and the probabilistic nature of it succeeding is that the spell is party friendly and it's AoE. Those are really important. So the chance of the spell ever doing something bad to your own party is 0. Doesn't touch your own party members. And also, since it's AoE, with a pretty big radius of 15 feet, and there's a separate check for each character against which this spell is cast. It's probabilistic, but when you compare it to the single target debuff spells, of which all these other ones are single target, right? I guess True Sight is not, but Breach, Ruby Ray, these spells are all single target. So if you're comparing single target to an AoE spell, you need to take into account that the AoE spell is going to have many different chances to achieve the same debuff that you would with the single target spell. AoE is hugely powerful when you're talking about damage, and it's even more powerful, I think, when you're talking about debuffs. So yeah, you have a probabilistic chance of getting this off, but if you're casting it into a group of 5 enemies and you get 5 different chances, and each one of those instances would have taken you a breach to cast against that individual enemy, this remove magic starts to look a lot more attractive. If it hits on any one of the 5 enemies, then you've already accomplished just as much as a breach would. So yes, it's probabilistic, but AoE is a major difference, which makes the probabilistic nature much easier to live with when you consider that the alternatives are single target spells. If Breach was AoE, then great. Then Breach becomes, I think, a much better spell, and you probably rely less on remove magic because of the AoE nature of the alternative. But it's not. It's not. Only remove magic is AoE, and it's super powerful when it goes off even on half of the enemy party. So that needs to be factored in. I think the other thing that should be factored in is that given this has a cast time of 3, it can be spammed out with improved Alacrity and Vecna in an instantaneous fashion, and you have the opportunity in tough fights to cast this multiple times to have a greater chance of debuffing the entire enemy party at the same time. And that's worth doing. You can launch 2 instances of remove magic and then follow it up with 2 Abidalzims, and if you're a high enough level caster, like you're in mid to high 20s level, that combination of spells is going to completely destroy the vast majority of enemies you'll face in this game, even enemies that are loaded up with a ton of different combat protections. It'd be much more difficult to accomplish that through True Sight than multiple breach spells, using up all your level 5 spells with breach. It's possible, but it's just going to take longer and more spell slots from higher levels that could be used for damage instead. So when you take into account those two things, that this is AoE and you can cast it multiple times, of course, instantly with Vecna, the probabilities start to look pretty decent if you're at all at comparable levels to the enemies whose spells you're trying to debuff. So let's look at a little chart here that illustrates how the probabilities work in some real in-game examples. So let's say that you're in sort of a mid BG2 fight. I'll give some levels of some opposing mages that you would pretty commonly face in that type of fight. UNT mages have opposing levels of 12 or 15. Cowled Enforcers are level 14. And as another example, Licks are level 11. By the way, this spell, Remove Magic, does work on Liches. Even though level 5 and below spells are not supposed to work on them, Remove Magic does. And Liches are only level 11. So let's say you're going up against an enemy that's sort of in this range of some scary spellcasters that you face through mid BG2. And your level by that time, it's very reasonable that your level might be level 15, say. If you're level 15 casting against a level 11 Lich, then you have a 70% chance of dispelling that Lich. If you cast the spell twice against the Lich, that's 91% chance of dispelling. And that cancels all invisibility and all combat protections. If you cast it 3 times in a row through a spell trigger or just getting 3 rounds or 3 mages or 3 rounds of the spell going off, that's a 97% chance to dispel the Lich's mislead plus all combat protections, leaving the Lich a sitting duck. So as you can see, if you're getting multiple people in the AoE of this spell, or you have chances to cast it multiple times, it starts to look highly effective, even if you don't have massive level differences between yourself and the enemies you're going against. By the time you get to late TOB, you max out at level 31, and enemies that you might face in that time, Irenicus is level 30, Amelisan is level 31, Kangax is level 27, Shangalar is level 26, Laen, who drops the Staff of the Magi, is level 18, as some other examples. So if you're at level 31, you're going to be equal to or significantly better leveled than many high-level enemy spellcasters in the game. So at very, very late game, when you've reached your full potential, Remove Magic becomes one of the most powerful spells in the game. You have pretty high chances to have this be effective against enemies, especially if you're casting multiple instances of it and catching multiple enemies inside the AoE. For example, if you're level 31 going up against Kangax, so you have a 4-level bonus, each instance of this is going to have a 70% chance to hit. And if you cast it 3 times, you would then have a 97% chance of dispelling Kangax's protections, just as an example. So I think at the end of the day, what these probabilities mean is that if you it makes this spell very playstyle specific. If you tend to play with a full party of 6 members, and you tend to not be a completionist, so you're staying on the mainline storyline and you're sort of beelining through the saga, then you're always going to be a little underleveled, and enemy spellcasters are probably going to be equal or higher level to you. That's not true for all. UNT mages is an example, level 12 or 15. You're going to be at that level through mid BG, even if you're taking that cutting edge approach, you're going to hit that level by mid BG2. So this spell is still effective situationally, but if you're really taking that approach, you're playing with 6 party members and you're not a completionist, so you're not doing many side quests, you're following the main quests, you're advancing through the plot rapidly, then yes, you're going to be a little underleveled. And if you're underleveled, then the spell is really hard to get off. And you should probably take a different approach. You're going to need to take the True Sight and Ruby Ray and Breach approach, or Pierce Magic and Breach approach. But I like to play this game solo. If you're playing this game solo or with a party of 2 or 3, then Remove Magic becomes completely busted because you're generally going to be over-leveled and compared to your enemies, even if you have fewer members in your party. And that's going to make this spell extremely strong. Even if you just like being a completionist and doing a lot of side quests and maybe farming some XP here and there in the Ankeg Cave in BG1 or different areas where you can rest and have enemies spawn in BG2, then if that's more your playstyle, then this is still going to be a really powerful spell for you, even if you're playing with a party of 4 to 6, because you're going to be on about equal or slightly higher levels than enemy spellcasters. If you have a bard in your party and that bards level really quickly, and the bard can cast Remove Magic, that is going to be extremely powerful, regardless of your playstyle. So I think, I have to highlight that this spell is playstyle dependent, and it's not going to look great to somebody who stays on the cutting edge of the main saga storyline and also plays with full party. But to everybody else, it's at least situationally powerful against mid-level caster enemies that you face, like UNT mages or Cowled Enforcers or Liches. And for most people, I think, who are playing more completionist style, you have mods installed with a bunch of side quests, or you're playing solo, then this spell is extremely powerful. And any way you slice it, by the time you get to mid-20s levels in SOA, you're going to be equal or higher level than almost any spellcaster in the game. And that, again, turns this spell into something extremely powerful at very high levels, where you're getting rid of project images and super high level resistance spells and protection from magical weapons and all the super high level buffs that make it tough to kill enemies. You're taking them all down with a single AoE party friendly spell. So this was a lot about Remove Magic, but personally, although this is probabilistic, I find that that it's so effective and deadly, and the AoE dynamic mean that I'm usually getting something positive out of this spell. When it does go off, it's the most deadly debuff in the game. And so that means there's something to be said for it. I always end up stocking Remove Magic as I get to very high levels in late SOA and through TOB. And I think it's the best way to reliably win fights against many high-level enemies in TOB is to hit them with multiple Remove Magics and then blast them with your Skull Traps and your Abidelziums, etc. I love this spell, and I rate it an 8 out of 10. Next up, the hits keep coming. This is Skull Trap. Skull Trap has a range of 60 feet, a cast time of 3. Area of effect is an 11-foot radius. Oh, I think that was corrected in the spell description. So that is a smaller radius than Fireball. 11-foot radius, they correctly reflected that in the spell description here. Saving throw reduces damage to half. When this spell is cast, a skull is thrown by the caster at the target area. The skull floats in the area until a creature comes within 8 feet of it. When this happens, the skull is triggered and explodes, damaging everyone within an 11-foot radius. The damage inflicted is equal to 1d6 per level of the caster, or half with a successful saving throw for a spell. When casting the spell, it is wise to set it far away from the party lest they set it off accidentally. This spell, already talked about it a lot, so you can tell that I'm going to think this is a strong spell. It is. This is the second best damage spell in the game. after Abidelzims, which you get only at level 8. This spell just kicks ass. The type of damage that it does, magic damage, is very rarely resisted, even through TOB. It's AoE damage, and it scales up to level 20. At level 20, you're doing between 20 and 120 damage with this spell prior to saves. So an average of 70 damage to each creature that misses saves, and 35 to a creature that makes its save. Given that you can hit multiple targets with this, it's really easy to do 200 plus damage per cast of this spell. That's insanity. That's, more damage than a 10 APR fighter is going to do in many instances, given resistances and the need to get within range of enemies. You do it all at once, and you can wipe out entire groups of high-level enemies with this spell. Given the casting time of 3, with improved alacrity and Robe of Vecna, you can also spam out up to 6 plus of these things inside a single round and do 1,000 plus damage in a single round through this spell. It's simply awesome to use the spell that way. And there's another reason this spell is awesome is it's not party friendly, which very few AoE damage spells are, especially not at level 3. I think you never find a spell so good to be party friendly AoE damage at level 3. But there's a protection spell, Protection from Magical Energy, which is super long lasting and that you're going to want to cast on your entire party and yourself anyway. So if you have that spell up, you can never get damaged by chucking skull traps, and you can throw these things all around yourself with impunity and just blow enemies up very easily. This is an awesome spell. This spell is one of the first spells in the game that really, especially once you start to level it and get it scaled up to the full D20, this will make you feel like you really have the power of magic at your fingertips when you're just blasting to death entire groups of enemies before they can even get near your party at range. Just an awesome spell. So I rate this spell a 9 out of 10, the highest rating for any level 3 spell. I'm always taking, I think early on in the game, Haste, Protection from Fire, and maybe some Melf's Minute Meteors look attractive, or at least equally as attractive to this spell when you're doing sort of maybe 5d6, 7d6. By the time you start to get to early SOA and you're doing 12d6 with this spell, all the way up to doing 20d6 in late SOA to TOB, this spell is awesome, and it's hard to justify other spells over it. By late game, like late SOA and TOB, in level 3, I'm taking maybe Protection from Fire if I don't have items or a combo of spells to get me to 100% fire resistance, but I'm usually taking just Remove Magic and Skull Trap at level 3 and more Skull Traps, just because this spell does an insane amount of damage all the way through the end of the saga. Rating 9 out of 10. Awesome spell. All right, we have, I think, 3 or 4 spells left here in level 3. The next spell is Slow. Slow has a duration of 1 turn, a cast time of 3, an area of effect of a 15-foot radius, and a saving throw negates. A slow spell causes creatures to move and attack at half of their normal rates. It negates haste, but does not otherwise affect magically hasted or slowed creatures. Slowed creatures have an armor class and attack penalty of -4. Creatures save at -4 versus this spell. So this is, yes, it's yet another crowd control spell, yet another, if enemies fail their save, something bad will happen to them spell. But this is one of the few spells of that type in the game that I think is worth considering, along with things like Web, which I've talked about at length in this video and primarily in the level 2 video. Why is it one of the better types of these spells? Well, it has a bunch of different factors that rarely come together. There's a -4 saves penalty, it's area of effect, it's party friendly, And this main benefit of slowing enemies does have a nasty impact on your enemies. Enemies that do melee attacks, which is most enemies that you'll face in this game, are going to have a real hard time closing on you to do their attacks. Enemies that are spellcasters are going to have their casting times increased if they're slowed, increasing the chance that you're going to be able to interrupt their casting. So it's a pretty nasty effect. Not totally incapacitating enemies, but for many enemies, functionally incapacitating them because you can kite them easily. And this spell has these other dynamics of a saves penalty, being AoE, and being party friendly. That said, I think this is still just a crowd control spell in a spell level that has some spells that do much nastier things, like Skull Trap and Remove Magic, which completely debuff and kill, oftentimes in one shot, your enemies. So it's hard to say that this spell is awesome when you have some even nastier options that do guaranteed damage, or have a really strong debuff effect, and do not have the same saving throw to negate mechanic as slow, even with the -4 penalty. The other factor to think about is that towards the end of BG2 and during TOB, enemies, almost all of them, will be either immune to this spell or will have such super high saves that they're going to save anyway versus this spell. And you're better off trying to slow those enemies with Flail of the Ages, which has no save and is a different type of slow that's not resisted by nearly as many enemies. So sort of by late game, this isn't very effective. You're always going to want to be taking Remove Magic or Skull Trap instead of this. And how good you think this spell is through BG1 and SOA is going to largely come down to your style of play. If you really like crowd control spells or RNG spells that are pretty good, where your enemies still have a chance to avoid them, then you might prioritize this spell. Personally, if I have access to the second best damage spell in the game at this level, which is Skull Trap, I'd rather just get guaranteed damage and kill my enemies than try to have a chance to CC them. This spell, it does reduce AC, but it doesn't give guaranteed hits like Web by stunning enemies, and slowed enemies can still do things against you. So for me, I'd rather just take the round to prioritize a damage spell and prefer Skull Trap over Slow. Or at lower levels, I'm probably taking some Haste as well over Slow. This isn't a heavily used spell for me, but again, it's stylistic. And this is one of the better crowd control spells in the game because of the dynamics I talked about. So I'll rate this spell a 4 out of 10. Not any scalability into SOA or very late BG2, but a strong spell in BG1 and early SOA. 4 out of 10. Next up is Spell Thrust. Spell Thrust is a cast time of 3, area of effect of 1 creature, no save. When this spell is cast at a target creature, it will dispel all of the spell protections of 5th level and lower affecting it. This includes the following spells: Minor Spell Deflection, Minor Globe of Invulnerability, Spell Immunity, and Minor Spell Turning. The target's magic resistance, if any, does not affect this spell. So in level 3, we got the first instance of a spell protection in Minor Spell Deflection, and now we have the first instance of a counter spell to that, which is Spell Thrust. This spell is sort of the first anti-spell protection spell that mages have access to, and it's pretty limited in that it'll only dispel these spells of 5th level and lower. So there is a use case for this, but given that it's the only spell before level 4 spells and Secret Word arises that can take down these types of spell protections, but it's a pretty limited use case. It's sort of only relevant in the mid game in late BG1 or early BG2. In practical use, I haven't really found any fights where this was essential, even playing with SCS. And the main reason is going back to this point that aside from spell immunity and the globes here, at least for or spell immunity and minor globe invulnerability, for minor spell deflection and minor spell turning, those do not protect against AoE. So if an enemy mage has one of those up, then I'm just gonna blast down that mage with Skull Trap. And for some of these other spell protections, generally speaking, if you're going up against an enemy mage, certainly in the base game that's casting spell immunity, you're going to want something more powerful and have access to something more powerful than Spell Thrust to take on that mage. And if the enemy mage has a minor globe up, which would probably be the number one use case for this, then probably physical damage or remove magic are going to be just as good a way to eliminate that mage versus trying to dispel the minor globe through this spell and then cast spells against that mage. So I think all in all, there is a use case for this. It's pretty limited. It's limited to the mid game. Remove magic is still a far more effective debuff to stock. That's more of a Swiss Army knife. And many of the multiple of the spell protections that this would take down don't protect against AoE spells anyway, which is your bread and butter to kill enemies. So this spell does have a use, but it's obsoleted as soon as you get to Secret Word in level 4, and you would never return to it after that point in the game. I'll rate this a 3 out of 10. Next up is Vampiric Touch. Vampiric Touch has a cast time of 3, an area of effect of 1 creature, no saving throw. When this spell is cast, the target loses 1d6 hit points for every 2 caster levels to a maximum drain of 66 for a 12th level caster. These hit points are added to the caster's current hit points, with any hit points over the caster's normal maximum treated as temporary additional hit points. These temporary hit points last for 1 hour. Note, this spell may not be stacked. So what does this do? It's a single target damage spell that does do magic damage, which is the best damage type in the game, the least resisted, as we've talked about. But it's single target, and therefore it'll always do less damage than a Skull Trap. I guess theoretically, if you're only capturing a couple enemies in your Skull Trap and you're low level and they make their save, then the Skull Trap might do less. But in almost all circumstances, let me think about this. Yeah, in almost all circumstances, or all circumstances, all real world circumstances anyway, Skull Trap is going to do more damage. So, and it's the same damage type. So really the only reason to take this over Skull Trap would be for the hit point adding effect of the spell, right? You're going to add hit points to yourself equal to what you drain from the opponent, up to 66. So an extra 6 to 36 hit points. For most mages, that's going to be something like maybe a 20 to 30% boost to HP. That's not nothing, especially if you're a fighter mage. Maybe you want a little bit more tankiness. But the problem, I think, is that really as a mage, you're not relying, no matter whether you're a fighter mage or just a pure class, you're not relying on your hit points to save you. That's one reason that mages are such strong tanks, is because you have access to mirror image, AC reducing spells like improved invis and blur. You have access to stone skin. You have access to all of these resistance spells to protect you against magic damage. Those things are much more important and are going to give you much more survivability than an extra 6 to 36 hit points. You need to rely on your spell protections, not having a little bit extra hit points as a mage. There is a use case for this. It's one of the few ways that you can buff yourself as a fighter mage, but haste is always going to be better, and you should be relying on your spell protections as a fighter mage, not Vampiric Touch. So I'll give this a rating of a 3 out of 10. It's not a terrible spell. It would, for example, immediately be the best damage spell at level 2, but it's not a level 2 spell. It's level 3, where it has to contend with Haste and Skull Trap.
both of which are much better spells for mages and fighter mages. So 3 out of 10 rating for Vampiric Touch. Finally, the last spell in level 3, and it's a doozy. Wraithform. Wraithform has a duration of 2 rounds per level, a cast time of 1. Wow, you can get it off quickly. The area of effect is the caster. When this spell is cast, the wizard and all her gear become insubstantial. The caster is subject only to magical or special attacks, including those by weapons of +1 or better enchantment, or by creatures otherwise able to affect those struck only by magical weapons. The wizard also gains 25% resistance to magic damage. While in Wraithform, the caster cannot cast either arcane or divine spells. Small caveat at the end there. So this is a classic example of a scroll. It's sort of like glitter dust, I guess, in BG1, that a scroll that's hard to obtain, not sold in the stores, and you only get it later in the game, and yet that doesn't have any relationship to whether the spell is good or not. This is a great example. I think the only scroll that exists for this, maybe in the entire game, but certainly in BG1, the earliest one is from Pratt's party in the catacombs near the end of BG1, when you're escaping the catacombs under Candlekeep. So you have to wait a long time to get access to this level 3 spell, and the spell still sucks, especially if you only get access to it at that point, for a few reasons. First, it's only protecting you against magical weapons it's only protecting you against normal weapons, not magical weapons with +1 or better enchantment. By the time you get this at end of BG1, all the tough enemies, including the ones that you have to kill to get this, are using +1 or better weapons against you. So this spell would have absolutely no effect against those enemies. The 25% resistance to magic damage, I guess it's the first instance of being able to obtain a resistance to magic damage, but 25% is just not going to cut it. You're never going to cast this as opposed to higher level resistance spells to slightly reduce magic damage against you, when the consequence is you have to nerf yourself. The obvious drawback is that you can't cast any spells after you cast this. So that's going to have a much more detrimental impact on your ability to escape and survive than any benefit from this spell. I think the developers must have intended that you cast this in the thick of battle, because it does have a cast time of 1. But if you do that, I guess it means that you have to be running from low-level enemies that are not using magical weapons. And if that's the case, why do you need this spell? Why not use Invisibility, Mirror Image, Stone Skin, all these other things that would allow you to still cast your spells and would also adequately protect you against such low-level enemies? Or for that matter, I can't think of an enemy that uses a normal weapon that can't be killed with a single skull trap, which you'd be giving up to take this spell. So just turn around and try, if you can, cast a skull trap and just end the fight rather than nerfing yourself through this spell. So the last use case I thought of here is maybe if you're a fighter mage, you want to cast this and then go melee enemies, sort of like an early like BG1 version of Tensors. But again, it's only useful if you're fighting enemies that don't have access to +1 weapons. So you're sort of you're a level 5 mage or above that's a fighter mage. So you're probably pretty powerful. You have some weapon proficiencies. You have 2 to 3 APR. And you probably have magic weapons of your own, and yet you feel like you need this buff to go fight like kobolds. Probably not. You could kill them with one shot with a wand of fire. You could probably go solo those enemies without having access to this spell at all at that stage. So pretty limited utility spell, just given the fact that it nerfs you by disabling your spell casting and only protects you against normal weapons. Very underwhelming. A spell that I usually transcribe the scroll but never cast it on myself once through the entire saga. Really a poor spell, stands out as one of the worst spells at this level. Rating 1 out of 10.
So this ended up being a long one, just given all the different game mechanics that were introduced at level 3, like haste, spell protections, resistances, and remove and dispel magic. But an awesome one to go through, because this is level 3 is where the mage really starts to get some super powerful spells that make this the most fearsome character in Baldur's Gate. And some spells like remove magic and skull trap and protection from fire that scale all the way through the late game, and you're enjoying casting them when you first get them in BG1, and you're going to be enjoying roasting enemies with them all the way in the very end of the saga. So a great spell level 3. And I think, just to recap where these ratings came out, looking back on the whole level, you have Skull Trap, the second best damage spell in the entire game. You get access to it at a low level, and it'll scale with you as you go through the saga. Rated that a 9 out of 10. Always a good spell to have. Remove Magic and Haste, rated an 8 out of 10. Remove Magic, the most devastating debuff spell in the game. That's extremely, extremely powerful unless you play on the cutting edge of the main storyline and are always underleveled, which I tend not to be. So Remove Magic, super powerful spell, becomes more powerful as you hit level 30, level 31 late in TOB, and it's an AoE debuff. 8 out of 10. Haste, the best combat buff for BG1 and all the way through first half of BG2 until you get the even more busted version later on. An 8 out of 10 for Haste. 7 out of 10 for protection from fire. A good bread and butter elemental protection spell. They protects you against the most common form of elemental damage in the entire game and lasts for a long duration. And then after that, Melfs, we talked about plenty. Clearly not as strong as these other spells, in my view, but a good spell. Slow, a quality, one of the few quality crowd control or save versus spells in the game. And then from there, there's some situationally useful spells at level 3 and some garbage down below. And just as we had some of the best spells in the game with Skull Trap, Remove Magic, and Haste in this level, we have some of the most insulting, horrible, embarrassing spells in Dire Charm, Monster Summoning 1, Wraithform, and Hold Undead in this level. Glad to get this video out. Thanks a lot for following along. If you disagree with me, if you have any thoughts on different ways that spells can be comboed or something that I missed or got wrong in this video, please let me know in the comments, and I'll see you soon, hopefully, for level 4.